Thank you. I'm kind of talking around the house. Okay, next week, I think so, Wednesday night. About 7, I mean.
Sure.
Okay,
Well,
okay.
that's for you, yeah.
Okay, great,
Thank you.
great.
Yeah, ready to start.
Well, it's hello again. Bienvenidos. Gracias por estar con nosotros. It's good to see everyone again. As you remember, my name is Brian Baird, with our wonderful host and hero and so much of this stuff, Juan de Dios, the congresista, a representative from the embassy. We're glad to have you here. We have today a very difficult task, but one that's an important task, and it is to try to cover about 200 years of US history in a very short time. We will try to do that not to memorize particular dates, because that's not the purpose of this class. This is not to say, what year did this happen or what day did this happen? It's more to get the big picture of how our history was shaped and how it affects who we are today and how it affects our understanding of the country. And what we will do is, as always, we'll have some lecture, and then I have actually quite shocking and sad news about our guest speaker. I've never had this happen before, but Kathleen Duvall, who was going to speak to us, a very prominent historian who knows a great deal about the history of our revolution and the Civil War period, texted me 9 minutes ago and said that she and her students are in what we call lockdown because there's an active shooter on their campus. Sends chills as I say this, but she can't join us because she's in active lockdown. The question came up. She sends her regrets, by the way. It's pretty classy. She's apologizing to us that she can't join us because her campus is completely locked down. A few weeks ago, one of the questions at the end of the class session was, what do you think about proposals to make guns more available here in Argentina? And I raised some cautionary notes about that. And I have some readings, which Juan and we have to find a way to post those. But I hope your thoughts will be with Kathleen and her students and everyone on the campus. Bienvenidos. We have, unfortunately, it's become an all too common, I don't know what the Spanish word is. In English, it's called the platitude. It's whenever there's a school shooting, people say, oh, our thoughts and prayers are with them.
Yes.
And we say it so often in our country that it sounds like it's just a line that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are with them. We are in that spirit. So anyway, so yes,
Which is university?
I think University of North Carolina, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So anyway, I will share with you her bio later on. But we will press ahead, and what we'll do in the time where she was going to speak, we'll have questions and discussions. So with that, let me begin if I and share the screen with my PowerPoint. I'm doing the sorry, there we go. That look right? Oh, yes, okay. So we're going to start in a little bit. Obviously, we've already started in the usual way with the announcement of our guest speaker situation with the shooter on her campus. But there were some very significant events happened in the US this last week. And I want to start by addressing those. One was a very positive event, the 60th anniversary of ¿Está bien?
Don't worry.
What's that?
Don't worry about that.
The very positive event was the 60th anniversary of an event called the March on Washington Civil Rights event, at which Dr. King, a friend of mine, spoke, John Lewis, who we'll talk about later on today. There was that very positive event. There was also what I consider one of the most, for me personally, depressing and frankly dangerous things I've seen in my country. And that may seem like an exaggeration, but I want to give you the context. We had the first round of the presidential primary debates for the Republican Party on a conservative television program station called Fox News. owned by Rupert Murdoch, you know, the Murdoch thing. And there was a question asked at the debate, as you'll see in a moment, about whether or not the candidates for the presidency of the United States would support the former president, even if he were convicted. And I want to play that segment for you. And here it is. Let me know if you can hear it. Oh, wait a second. I probably got it. Sorry.
That's because I can off.
Back. Okay, let's try. Again. If I play it, will it come across?
Right, please.
All right. Can you hear it on the screen? No? We may have to rewind it for a second. You see?
Juan, pusieron para compartir sonido cuando compartieron pantalla. Fíjate que tiene que estar cliqueado eso.
Down.
No, you need to press to share.
Yeah, share screen.
No,
Yeah, I got it.
screen and sound.
Okay, we'll play it again. Lo siento, it's important.
Yeah.
We're going to start again from the beginning, if we can.
In the meantime, for everybody, we have people from all Latin America and the Caribbean, from Guatemala, Ecuador, Colombia, everywhere.
My apologies for the technical difficulty, but it's such an important moment. I want you to actually see it Let me know if this sound works.
No, no se escucha. Fíjate de dejar de compartir y volver a compartir, pero abajo hay para cliquear una opción de compartir sonido.
We needed to know this before. The computer is not connected to the Zoom.
All right.
Yeah, you're connected by there. Pilar, ¿estás ahí?
Sí, sí.
Pilar, él está conectado por Zoom como si está compartiendo pantalla es porque está como coadministrador.
Sí.
Entonces, ¿por qué entonces no puede, la gente
Porque cuando comparten pantalla, en la parte de abajo de todo hay un botón para tildar que dice compartir sonido. Tienen que cliquear eso.
Already. You do.
Dejen de compartir.
Yeah, again,
Yeah.
here,
But I know it's done.
share sound, exactly. And optimize video, yeah, also, all right. So share.
That's
And
what I
now,
thought we did.
yeah. Where's the,
Maybe it's a mute button.
Former President Trump has been indicted
Ahí se escucha.
in 4 different states on 91 counts. He will be processed tomorrow in Georgia at the Fulton County Jail for charges relating to the 2020 election loss.
You all signed a pledge to support the eventual Republican nominee. If former President Trump is convicted in a court of law, would you still support him as your party's choice? Please raise your hand if you would. Just hold on. So just to be clear, Governor Christie, you were kind of late to the game there, but you raised your hand.
No, I'm doing this. Look, I'm doing this.
And I know you didn't.
No, come. What's and then look? Look, here's the bottom line. Someone's got to stop normalizing this conduct. Okay? Now, and whether or not you believe that the criminal charges are right or wrong, the conduct is beneath the office of President of the United States. And you know, this is the great thing about this country. Booing is allowed, but it doesn't change the truth. It doesn't change the truth.
Walter? Walter?
You can continue. Okay.
Everybody needs to turn off the sounds of computers.
Okay, everybody now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Germán está rebotando.
Not sure why.
Sorry. It wasn't me. It was the operator. You were right.
Okay.
Operator.
He did it. So. Do the mic.
Perdón, está muteada la computadora.
It is, I think it is in the. ¿Ahora escuchan?
Ahora sí.
¿Escuchan? Perfecto, disculpas, gracias. Listo.
Okay, so here's the situation. One of the two major political parties, the former president has been indicted, which means the court has been accused of crimes in 4 different occasions and locations. And the question was to the candidates for president, would you support him even if he were convicted? And one of the crimes he's been accused of is essentially trying to overthrow a duly elected election and then to cover up his efforts to do so. It's not to me just the fact that people said they would still vote for him, but also how they did it, to look at one another and see who's raising their hand or not before you decide. Says you're not really doing this on the principle. You're doing it as political advantage. Well, here's some thoughts that other folks have had about this situation. Is it not advancing? All right, well, now we're.
What was this? Right. What's that? The debate.
This was Monday night. It's a week ago, Monday night. But what I'm not seeing, one is I'm not able. There we go. It's delayed, so it's taking me a bit. This is the oath that the President of the United States has to take. I solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Well, the Constitution of the United States has the 14th Amendment as part of it. This was one of the, as we discussed in prior weeks, this was the amendment put in place post our Civil War, which we'll talk about again today, that basically said if you participated in sedition against this country, you're barred from holding political office. The reason was you had southern states that had broken away, had declared war on the country as a whole. And now, after the war, there were people who had been participating in the seditious rebellion running for office again. And you can't really have people serve in office who tried to overthrow the government. So this bill, this amendment passed, it was ratified. It was actually a condition. You had to ratify it to rejoin the Union at the time. And as you can see, the highlighted text makes it pretty clear if you engaged in insurrection or supported insurrection or rebellion, you're disqualified from public office. It doesn't say if you were convicted of a crime even. It just says if you engaged in that. There are a couple of very powerful arguments, and I have them on, we're going to create a file where you can read the entire argument. This particular one here is important because you may remember in a prior class that we talked about a group called the Federalist Society, which is a very conservative organization. And many of their nominees for the courts were nominated and put in place by President Trump. Two of their members have prepared an extensive, this document is 126 pages long, outlining why the former president is disqualified from running for office again. And yet there were the majority, clear majority of his candidates to replace him, take that seat, were saying he's disqualified. An alternative perspective, very similar, but from different authors, is in this article in the Atlantic magazine, a very prominent magazine of nonfiction, but some fiction as well. But in this case, two very prominent U.S. attorneys opining on the same issue. Now, with that historical context, and we're going to get back to that actually at the very end of our discussion in an interesting way. So I mentioned at the start, we're going to try to go through about 200 years of history, not memorizing dates and names, but getting the grand sweep of things. So the topics we're going to cover are here. You'll see them as we go along. One of the real primary sources, if you want to understand our country, the United States in the early years, you would look at a work, famous work by Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who came to the United States in 1823 and traveled very much of what was then the US. And his point was to say, what is it that is unique about this American government? What can we learn about it? How does it relate? Do we want to zoom this in a little bit? Don't worry. Okay. What do I discover here? He wrote a 2-volume report. The first published in 1935, the second, it says 1935, sorry about that. There's a big typo. 1835 and 1840, sorry about that. And what he did was he looked at the key features of our country relative to other nations. De Tocqueville was a real admirer of the United States, but he was also a critical judge. And importantly, when you read, if you look for de Tocqueville quotes, you will find a lot of quotes from de Tocqueville that he never said. And there's a very famous one basically saying something to the effect of that the American Republic will prosper until the Congress learns that it can buy votes by giving people's money away. That was not de Tocqueville who said it. It was somebody in the 1950s who said it and then attributed it to de Tocqueville. But you'll find it almost everywhere you look, and it is quoted again and again. It's not, and I've looked thoroughly through both volumes of de Tocqueville. It's not there. So watch out for this. This is the one I mentioned. But there's a lot of other misattributions. But what he did say was powerful. These are the things de Tocqueville observed about the U.S. in general. One, he said that the American people will form associations like he'd never seen before, meaning if there's an issue, the people gather together on their own, not mandated by the government, but they gather together and say, how can we address this? And his point at the time was they have to do that because they're living in such a way that if you need help one day, somebody's going to help you, and you have that the next day you have to help them. his premise at the time was interesting. It was because in general, there was not great discrepancies in wealth. You didn't have a Versailles palace, for example, in the United States. And so everybody was more or less equal, so they helped one another. And it's a very powerful notion, this sense of American service, which I talked about the very first point of the very first class, that service is fundamental to our country and fundamental to any democracy. De Tocqueville was very concerned about the dangers of majorities and a tyrannical majority suppressing the rights of minorities. He also, at the same time, was interested in protecting individual rights. So there's that balance. And he was concerned about selfishness, about what happens if you become so enamored in enjoying your liberties and your opportunities that you forget about your broader society. He recognized the vital element of checks and balances, which we've talked about, and also the importance of decentralization, especially at the time that was so central, because the American Republic was expanding rapidly. It was in the days when transportation was very slow. There was no telegraph, as you all know. And so you've got to have dispersed governance for the system to work. You can't wait for everything to come from the central government. I think the strongest quote, and you'll see it in various translations, but I think the strongest and most important quote from de Tocqueville is this. Essentially, the great privilege of America doesn't simply consist in being more enlightened than other nations. He thought much of the US was, but in their being able to repair the faults they may commit. Meaning we're far from perfect, but we have a system that allows us to correct its mistakes. And that's been part of our culture really from the very, very beginning. Some big mistakes like slavery, like the denial of women's rights to vote and others, but we have a system that in theory at least has always been able to self-correct. That's being put to the test right now, I think. I'm really proud, actually, by a happy coincidence in my life, that one of the best books on how America came to be, the shape we know it, was by none other than my father-in-law, Walter Nugent, a very prominent historian. You see his book there. I brought a copy, which I will leave to Universidad Austral when we leave. Walter Nugent was very interested in how movements happen across countries and how the US became settled. I'm going to show you in a second two amazing maps that modern digital technology lets us see American progress in new ways. But we have to first start with what did the country look like when the first what European settlers arrived? And this is a map more or less. The native peoples did not keep cartographic maps like we know them now, but they were very keenly aware of where their own territory was, usually demarcated by rivers. This is our side of the river, by other natural geography. And because there was competition for resources, there would sometimes be battles between native groups because it was a matter of survival to protect your territory. This is more or less what the country, what the major tribes look like. And of course, you can get very micro in this because tribes protected their own areas. What happened to the native peoples? We've talked about this a bit, but one of the biggest things that really wiped out the native peoples in both Latin America and the US was diseases. And a famous book called Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, I should have put that reference up, but he talks about how those elements decimated, beyond decimated, almost destroyed the native populations, both in South America, Central America, and the US and Caribbean. And this article talks about the history of diseases raging through native cultures, and interestingly enough, continuing today, as native peoples die in greater numbers from pandemics, as they continue to die in greater numbers from non-communicable diseases, and a number of other things. That tradition and history of native people suffering from diseases continues to this day. Well, so if we understand that at one point the continent was populated by native peoples, what happened after that? Well, some of you know that in the Treaty of 1783, Fredo Vitalo knows this very well, I'm sure, the US negotiated, having defeated the British in the Revolutionary War, negotiated a treaty, a peace treaty. And then the question was, okay, the British are leaving the continent. How much terrain do the colonies get? Well, they negotiated remarkably from what had been a fairly narrow band on the coast, a very narrow band of land on the coast, all the way west to the Mississippi. Basically, they took the existing colonies and said, extend your boundaries all the way west to the Mississippi River, where they didn't really know what was out there. But that's what they did. And that paved the way for lots of further expansion. I'm going to show you two amazing slides. And the first one I want you to just watch. It takes about a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes, but it's a graphic illustration of the progress of American US development across the continent. And you can see in the lower right, I'll prepare you for this because once I click it, it moves kind of fast, but you'll be able to see this march of US territorial acquisition, the Louisiana Purchase, acquisition of Florida, Texas, the Pacific Northwest, ultimately Florida. And this is worth just watching. You can watch this. Walter Nugent would have loved this map because it shows you how we progressed. So just watch this. You'll see on the right the initial colonies, and now you'll see gradually being added, and the years are ticking by below. You'll see additional territories being acquired, states being created, being added to the Union. And you can get a sense of how it's moving westward. You see, we just picked up Florida. And each one of these is, in many cases, it was a treaty. In some cases, it was combat. In other cases, it was just expansion of population. Purchase. What's that? And purchase in the case of the Louisiana Purchase, absolutely right. I should say, my guess is 90% of Americans have no idea how this map developed. We don't know our own country very well. We maybe in some general sweep of things. Okay, so I'm going to pause that. That will loop indefinitely. So now, how did we expand that way? This next map shows you. And Walter Nugent was big on this in his book. He basically said it was a combination of procreation, basically reproduction. The population of the European settlers, you combine the deaths of the native peoples from disease and frankly from combat and overtaking by the European settlers. But you watch the population just gradually sweep west and begin to make some bands out in California, in the San Francisco area predominantly. The southern part of California at the time, whoop, don't know what happened to that.
It's there.
It's still there, okay. The southern part was still in the hands of Mexico at that point, and Spain actually at that point, rather. But you see this sweep of population, and Walter Nugent's thesis, and I think it's well demonstrated, is that other countries could not keep up. They were too far away across the world, and if you've got this hugely reproducing European based settlement, and they're expanding, they can eventually take things over. And frankly, that's what happened with Florida. Spain realized we can't keep it. And the Louisiana Purchase was very similar. Napoleon needed a lot of money, and he couldn't do much with this land. He had small outposts down in New Orleans. They had a base, but he couldn't do much. And he said, "I'll sell this thing to you for pennies, really, almost." And so then you see, this is how the country became the shape it is, with that combination of treaties and population growth, et cetera. This is really interesting. It's a quote from Walter Nugent. Prior to 1860, the US population grew by about a third every decade. That's massive. In the time when this happens, in the 1800s, when he was studying this, and he was a scholar of demographic growth, the population growth in the US, the pace of that outpaced anything in the modern era. Population growth. Families were having 8, 9, 10 children, and many of them still surviving at that point. And that just, those children wanted somewhere to go. Plus, there was incoming immigration. So that's how we got the territory, with population and then treaty negotiations and purpose. Ballotopedia has a pretty good, it's another resource. Remember, throughout this class, I'll try to give you sources of information for future research. Ballotopedia, by the way, is one of the better sources, not only for historical information, but for ongoing data about current election campaigns, initiative, constitutional issues, etc. And they chart, and one of the most useful for those of us you teaching American history or studying it, they have one of the most useful charts I've seen about the sequence of purchases, land takeovers, etc., both detailing the dates and how it occurred. So you can see who we, and these are highlighted. You get to see the size. If you look at Louisiana Purchase, which I'll talk about more in just a second, the scale of that was unimaginable. The scale, we'll see that in just a second here. So I mentioned Napoleon is battling his fronts in Europe. One of the things that advantaged the US was not only our distance, but the Europeans were killing each other. And they decided they were so busy killing each other that they couldn't occupy themselves with North America, and really to a large degree in South America as well. There's some parallels, as you all know far better than I. But basically somebody suggested to Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, the president at the time, you know, I think if you made an offer, you might be able to buy the Louisiana Territory. And Jefferson said, really? And they sent somebody over, an ambassador, and they said, sure, what's your price? $15 million. You saw the expanse of the Louisiana Purchase. It's what I thought I had, 2,144,000 square kilometers. It's a massive area. It went from what's now the border of Mexico all the way up to Canada. It was just enormous. That more or less the size of Argentina. Yeah, I think so. The size of Argentina, the whole thing for $15 million. Now, interestingly enough, Jefferson probably didn't have the constitutional authority to do that, but he went ahead and did it, and it was pretty essential because it just bought, and it was so important that treaty of the first treaty with the British had gone west of the Appalachians, because that put us on the edge of the Louisiana Territory. I have to say, Spain didn't think that was even fair. They didn't think the British had the right to sell it, but Spain was in no position to defend it. They protested, etc., but they couldn't do much about it. So we've now taken this enormous piece of land, and nobody knows what's there. So Jefferson sends out to a group called the Lewis and Clark, the Corps of Discovery, led by two famous Americans, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. And they had about 40 people, including, interestingly enough, an enslaved man who was part of the Corps, and a dog, a great, huge Newfoundland dog, which came in very handy a number of times. And also, interestingly enough, a Frenchman who served as a translator, and his wife, a native woman named Sacagawea. I don't have time to go into this in detail, but this is out of a novel what happens. At one point, Lewis and Clark, they're traveling across the West. There's lots of native tribes there. It's tough going. They're dragging these boats upriver oftentimes. Not very sophisticated craft, no motors, sometimes sails, oftentimes literally in the water all day long with moccasins, which are just slippers, wading along, dragging these boats day after day. They're sick. There are rattlesnakes. They're afraid there's going to be an attack from Indians at any point. It's a really tough go. They get near the Rocky Mountains, and they're pretty desperate. Their traveling is very slow, and all of a sudden, what do they see coming across the plains? An Indian war party on horseback, and they're thinking, "Oh my God, we're going to have to fight for our lives here." Remember, they've got this Frenchman and his native-born wife named Sophia. Along comes this tribal war party. They're prepared to defend themselves or to negotiate. And Sacagawea goes, "Oh, it's my brother." It's unbelievable. But that's what happened. In the middle of the entire expanse of that enormous piece of country, who should come up but Sacagawea's brother, And she, of course, talks to him, hey, how you been? Who knows? But they decide they'll sell them some horses. They trade for horses. Instead of having a battle to the death, they get horses. And now they can actually ride a little ways across the country. It was a turning point for the exhibition. It truly happened that way. Amazing. Later on, when they got to my district, I'm proud to say that the core of discovery reached the Pacific Ocean in my congressional district on the coast of Washington. And there was a question about where they should spend the winter. They had hoped to get to the coast and find a sailing ship, because even though they were traveling across land, sailing ships had been to the Columbia River. And they had a letter from President Jefferson saying, if you find these guys, if they make it here, give them a ride home, will you? And they could never find a ship. So they realized we have to spend the winter here. And interestingly and significantly, they stopped at a little place, right, which I helped create as a national park when I was in office. They took a vote. Classic Americans, right? Where are we going to spend the winter? Do we spend the winter on this side, over on the other side in what is now Oregon? And here's what's beautiful about it. They recorded the vote. They actually, in the journals, believe it or not, Lewis and Clark kept very meticulous journals, and they protected those in boxes sealed with lead. And those journals to this day exist. They carried those journals, which have scientific notation and maps, scrupulous maps that are still valid today almost. They carried them downriver in these metal cans, carried them all the way back up. They didn't lose a one. Their rafts turned over, their canoes turned over. They dragged these things. They were precious treasures, and they still exist in Philadelphia. And my wife and I got to see them at one point. It was remarkable. But in their journals, they record the vote. And you know what's beautiful? Sacagawea, a native woman, and York, a black man, voted. And they recorded their votes and they counted their votes in terms of deciding where they would spend the winter. So it's a marvelous story. And if you want to read a great book about it, this book by Stephen Ambrose was hugely popular a while back. It's called Undaunted Courage. It's really a remarkable story of the American spirit moving west. Now, I should say at the time, happily, there were one or two minor skirmishes with natives and a couple of deaths as a result, but it was not like open warfare. And generally, they got along well. There were tensions, there were tense moments. In fact, the truth is, Lewis and Clark, when they arrived at the coast, were in terrible shape. It was November, winter's coming on in the Pacific Northwest, it's rainy, it's windy. They have this passage in their book, in their journals, where they say anybody would feel pity on us. Our clothes have dissolved in the rain. Their clothes were made of deer hides, right? I mean, they were killing deer and other things to eat. Their clothes are dissolving. They're in a little tiny place on the side of the river. The wind is hammering them. And what should happen? Along comes a native group in a canoe, handling the weather like nothing. They've got these magnificent war canoes, and they come and they trade for fish, etc. The native people could have wiped them out, could have killed them. Nobody had ever known what happened. And they didn't. They traded with them. They let them spend the year there in the winter and spend the winter there. That's the Chinook people. And I should say, to this day, I am still trying to get the Chinook people recognized by our federal government. But they saved the lives of Lewis and Clark. And this is a great movie. If you want to see a marvelous video series, one of the best documentary filmmakers, many would say the best in America, is a gentleman named Ken Burns. He's done a series on the Civil War, on the Lewis and Clark expedition, on jazz, on baseball, on the Vietnam War. He's an amazing documentary filmmaker. And he did this whole story, and I was honored to meet him and the other writer of this. They did a lot about this. So it's such a signature event, that exploration of the West by Lewis and Clark. So we've talked about the keys to expansion. I'm not going to repeat this, except that a few things. It wasn't just population growth. What other things helped make this happen? Well, there were alliances of convenience. The U.S. government formed alliances. It formed rivalries with France, with Germany, or with Britain, with Spain, sometimes competitive, sometimes in alliance. There was a certain necessity and freedom that gave you a need for innovation. If you're far from Europe and you're way out on the frontier, you've got to invent things. You've got to solve problems. So there's a certain inventiveness to the American spirit at the time. And some years ago, this other point here, the idea that things can be done differently. Some years ago, I read a wonderful book, A History of the World. And at the end of the book, it basically asks the question, what was the major contribution of Western civilization to the rest of the world? And there's a temptation to try to think of, well, a certain piece of invention, was it, you can't say gunpowder, it wasn't a Western invention, it was a Chinese and Japanese invention, probably. But what was it? Well, that particular history concluded the biggest innovation was the idea that things can be done different. That when you look at a situation, you don't say, well, this is how we always do it. You say, could this be done better? And once you have that idea, it just affects everything. As soon as you start looking at the world and saying, how could we do things better and differently? It affects everything, from transportation to agriculture, etc. Our governance structure also added to the ability of people to expand. It wasn't all centralized. People could go out, discover or occupy land, and then form their own governance. And they had an overarching structure in the Constitution and the federal government, but they didn't have to ask permission for Washington. But they also had a model. If we populate an area, we too are going to form a Republican, lower R, Republican form of government. And then, frankly, a free market economic system was prominent at the time, and it incentivized people to invent. So if you look at the expansion, it's not just population, it's innovation of all types. In weaponry, in transportation, in agriculture, in manufacturing, in communication, in community values and service, in science and engineering, and all of these work together. So innovation technologically improves transportation, transportation improves communication, communication allows you to collaborate and work together. All of these are part of the American story. And there was a religious element to it as well, as we'll talk about, this belief that somehow God wanted the American people, the European American people, to expand. And we'll talk about a fundamental concept there. Well, just for fun, and we aren't going to go into any detail about this, but I wanted to create a sense of this sweep of innovation over history. And so this is taken from, it's somewhat extracted, but innovation in the sense of weaponry, in the sense of transportation, in the sense of agriculture, the development of new harvesting and agricultural techniques, the development of new ways to create weapons and new kinds of weapons, the development of new sources of power in the sense of steam engines. Not that all of these were invented by US citizens, by no means, but they were adapted in important ways, and together, collectively, they helped make all this expansion possible. And so you'll see transportation, the Erie Canal. This was a fundamental transportation at the East Coast that allowed heavy cargoes of agricultural products and some manufacturing to move up and down rivers. The McCormick Reaper was a harvesting device that allowed much faster harvesting of grain mechanistically, pulled by horses, of course, at the time. But it wasn't just one man with a tool. It was a machine that could harvest much more material. The telegraph, the US invention, really revolutionized communication, allowed communication across great distances. In fact, there's a really interesting thing. In the capital of the United States, when you look at the dome, at the very top of the dome, there's a painting. The main part is showing George Washington going up into heaven. But he's surrounded by images of Greek and Roman gods interacting with American traditions. And there's one where the god Poseidon, the god of the sea, has his trident and the waves are around him. And he's holding something in his hand. It looks like a rope. But it's actually symbolic of the transatlantic telegraph cable. If you ever get to the Capitol and you look at that dome, it's filled with things. There's the goddess Ceres, the god of the harvest, and there is the McCormick Reaper. There's, oh gosh, I'm going to blank, Minerva, I think. And there's Ben Franklin doing his experiments with electricity. That interface of sort of religious iconography and American development. And I'm not going to go into all these, but you see things like barbed wire, which basically, this is wire with the little sharp points on it. So the open range of cattle roaming on the prairie, that stopped. People started saying, this is my territory, you can't go there. There were battles over it. And of course, the telephone and stuff. Oops. Now, a couple things. We're going to talk about some doctrines, both official and unofficial, that help guide this development. One that, of course, is so important for Latin America and for the US is a thing called the Monroe Doctrine. President James Monroe, in an address in 1823, basically there was concern that the European continent, the European nations, were starting to expand their colonization west. And in fact, colonies, as you all know here, had already rebelled against that. And Monroe, in what we call now the State of the Union, outlined something that became very fundamental to US policy, and now it became known as the Monroe Doctrine. And essentially it said a few things. It said there will be separate spheres of influence, meaning European countries, you can do your thing. We're not going to meddle in your activities, but don't meddle, don't interfere in activities here, either with us or with neighbors to the south. This is forgive the words here, but the idea was this is our hemisphere, not your hemisphere, and stay out. And if you try to intervene in this hemisphere, Monroe was asserting, we will see that even if it's not intervening with us directly, but intervening with independence movements to the south, we'll see that as an affront to our territory as well, and we'll oppose you. But we won't intervene with your fights. You can fight as much as you want in Europe, just don't fight here. This is another good source. It's the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. They've taken it upon themselves to create a great repository of presidential documents. And so you can find the actual text of Monroe's speech. It's not very long. I read the entire thing in preparation for this, and it's quite interesting. Beyond the Monroe Doctrine, he talks about a lot of other developments at the time, including how we were dealing with slavery. This is in 1823, and a number of other things. It's worth a read, just the original draft. These are some of the lines specifically. We don't have to read them here, but basically he's articulating this premise that I just outlined. We're not going to intervene in your affairs in Europe. We never have, was his argument. By the way, part of his assertion was, look, you folks in Europe, you're killing each other all the time. If you want to do that, fine. We're not going to take sides. We'll take whoever wins, we'll respect them, and we'll treat them in a manly manner, he says. We'll treat you with respect, but we're not going to take sides in that. But if you want to export that to here, you're not welcome to do that. That's his essence. But that then, what's so important was that Monroe Doctrine was then used to justify the expansion into Texas, into Mexico, into the Pacific Northwest, ultimately into other countries that in the Pacific. This sense that we're entitled to protect our hemisphere was fundamental, and is still cited today, by the way, is still cited today as part of US foreign policy, and almost we have this fundamental right. We don't have time, and I'll be honest, I don't have the expertise to go into a long history of US-Latin American relationships. Many of you know this far better than I, but I did find a very useful timeline. Turns out there's not a lot of these timelines, but this one is quite good. And so I've listed it here. It goes sort of point by point of the key events, and I know it's too microscopic here on this slide, but I want you to see that it exists because it's a very useful timeline created just by a university professor. And I love how when you read the posting on this, not here, you won't see it, but he basically says it's kind of almost open source. If I've left something out, let me know and I'll try to correct it. But as a walkthrough of key events in relationships between the US, yeah.
Sí, perdón, Juan, si vos puedes hacer la traducción.
No, go ahead.
Te quería preguntar cómo incidió. Sí, perdón. ¿Cómo incidió en la expansión hacia el oeste de Estados Unidos el Tratado de Guadalupe Hidalgo?
So the question is, how did the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo affect the expansion of the U.S.? We're going to get to that. It's a great question. We'll get to it in just a moment because we're going to move. So the Monroe Doctrine precedes the Mexican-American War. And so we'll get to that very shortly. You're perfect because we're going to get there. Excellent question. Yeah, super question. It's super important, right? Because that's where the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is the resolution to the Mexican-American War, which basically, if the Louisiana Purchase brought a big portion of land, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, as we'll see in just a moment, brought an enormous portion of land and resolved unfavorably for Mexico, but quite favorably for the United States, resolve that conflict? It's a great question. The other idea that's so important to understand about US philosophy is the idea of manifest destiny. Now, this was never an official policy. No political leader declared we have a manifest destiny. In fact, it came from a not well known at the time editorial, really, by a gentleman named John Sullivan in a Democratic leading, in the day, by the way, Democratic political party in this time period was the Southern, predominantly Southern, pro-slavery. So it flipped. Nowadays, the Democrats are more popular with civil rights, and the Republicans, the then party of Lincoln later on, is now much more on the sort of white supremacist side. At least some branches of the Republican Party are. So it kind of flipped. But at the time, this was not a lot of people paid attention to this. And I'll tell you something interesting. I spent more than an hour and a half trying to find the original source of this. And I couldn't find the entire text of this, but it was in a newspaper by a writer named John Sullivan. And it is one of the fundamental ideas about our country that you just have to understand. This idea, essentially, that God wanted the United States to be created, that we are on a divine mission here. And it's going to be a little hard to see some of this language, but I want to put some actual language up. I'm going to read it out loud, but it says, in moral, political, and national life, we may confidently assume that our country is destined to be the great nation of futurity. This is, but the reason it's called manifest is because they're saying it's so obvious that God wants us to become the most powerful nation, the example for everyone else. And so the risk here, of course, is if you believe that God wants you to do something, you can justify almost anything in the name of God because you're not taking other people's land, you're following God's will. And I should say, this is not meant as a criticism of the US. And it's really, I got to thinking about this. It's easy to read what's written here is quite arrogant. But my guess is pretty much every dominant nation on earth at one time or another has had comparable arrogance. I'm sure the Romans were pretty sure that their gods wanted them to win. The Greeks were pretty sure their gods wanted them to win. The European powers were pretty sure of that. And to be honest, football players, when they kick a goal, they point to the heaven as if God really thinks it's important. They scored a goal. I don't know about that, but there's maybe a bit of human nature to assume that God's on your side. And clearly, in America, there was a powerful trend to believe this. So America, the Lord quote, is destined for better deeds. It is our unparalleled glory that we have no reminiscence of battlefield. So what he's saying here, but in defense of humanity, we don't fight to take over anybody. We only fight to defend liberties. Well, if you're not a Native person and you're not a Black person and you're not a woman, that's really great. And if you're not a Mexican, that's really great. But his argument here, not accurate philosophically or historically, but his argument is there's something unique about us. We're just fighting to defend liberty, not like these people in Europe who are fighting over territory and which king owns what. But that's the argument. And again, this carries through American history to this day. To this very day, there is a whole segment, but I think it's the dominant attitude, whether people ever know the word manifest destiny. There is a sense that you see football games and whatever, that, the chant USA, they might as well chant manifest destiny. If they say USA, USA, that's like chanting manifest destiny. We're even playing manifest destiny out in the World Cup. Although we don't win the World Cup, I don't know how you explain that, but maybe Argentina is good at do this. But anyway, the last quote, and here's our vision. Here's what God wants us to do, basically. Carry the glad tidings of peace and goodwill where myriads now endure an existence scarcely more joy or enviable than the beasts of the field. Not only is it our destiny to do this, we're helping all those people out. When we obtain the land that Native peoples were on before, we're doing it to help them. We're bringing them our faith, our religious faith. We're bringing them the wonders of democracy. We're bringing them all the freedoms. So we are asserting with this. So we're the good guys here. Almost no matter what we do, we're the good guys. Now we're going to fast forward really more than 100 years, but to this very day in the US, there's a question about what's called American exceptionalism. I'm stepping out of history a little bit to make the connection for you, which I'll try to do throughout the course, as you know. What are the historical events? How do they connect with the America today? American exceptionalism, not that the idea started in 2023 by any means, it goes back to the 50s or more earlier, but it's this idea, the natural progression really from manifest destiny. And there are different takes on this. Here's an article, an opinion piece from the Heritage Foundation. Heritage is a very conservative think tank, very conservative. And this gentleman is opining that American exceptionalism is a good thing and that he's making some arguments. And I will be honest, personally, I think there is some truth to this. I think there's a lot of truth in the core fundamental level that there is something pretty special about America. Not that we're perfect, not that we haven't made mistakes, not that there are not many other countries that are very exceptional themselves, but I do think there is something special. And his argument here is, so frankly, this is a bit of a philosophical argument. He's trying to make the argument, how do we defend this concept of American exceptionalism when it's under attack from many domestic academics and public thinkers and internationally? So he's trying to spell out, and basically he says, and here's the important thing. What he's arguing here is, what is it that makes America exceptional? And what he basically says, it's because our nation was founded on a creed. A creed is a belief system, okay? It's a belief system, and he's saying it's not because of our religious background. It's not because we're of the same ethnicity, we're not. It's not because we have the most military or economic power. It's the exceptionalism of the United States derives from governance based on a creed, and that creed is one of liberty. It goes back to the Enlightenment, and in his argument here has also a fundamental basis in Christianity, as he describes it. So his whole point is, this is a very fundamental element of what makes our country special. And I should say, there have been political debates in the country where there have been questions put towards the candidates for a public office. Do you believe in American exceptionalism? And I will tell you that if you say, no, I do not, you are not likely to be elected. If you just say, oh, no, we're just like any other country. Now, one of his points here, it's a very intriguing one, is that on the liberal side, there's an attack on American exceptionalism that says basically, look, we talk about how pure we are, how democratic we are, but we have lots of cases, as happened many times in Latin America, where we have not been on the side of democracy. We have not been on the side of civil rights, and it's happened in many other countries. So where's our exceptionalism? That's the liberal critique. There's a conservative critique, which he's arguing against as well, which in the Heritage Foundation is a pretty interesting argument. He's saying on the conservative side, there are people who are saying we should have American exceptionalism because it implies that we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. And we may not want to hold ourselves to a higher standard because it may be in American self-interest not to be exceptional about liberty or human rights, etc. Now, the reverse argument is made here in an interesting article in Foreign Policy magazine, which is arguing, look, the exceptionalist idea is a myth. It makes assertions about the conduct and values of our country that don't coincide with reality. And so this is the other side of the take. And this is an ongoing debate, as I mentioned. A second argument, and you'll see arguments on both sides, but this is a predominant theme today right now. There's yet another different take, which kind of turns American exceptionalism on its head and basically says, look, we're exceptional in some not so good ways. And this particular article points out that when you look at, for example, mortality of American women in childbirth, you think the United States, with all its technical power, its economic opportunities, its wonderful medical capacity, should lead the world in the lowest level of maternal death. It's not true at all. There are many countries that have much lower maternal mortality rates in the United States. And this article talks about a number of other variables on which, if America is so exceptional, we're exceptional in the wrong way in some other cases. And some of you who have joined late may know that I'm going to anticipate this. Our guest speaker today, Kathleen Duvall, embodied this a little bit when she wrote me about 9 minutes before the class was to start and informed us that she was on her college campus. They could not go out of their classroom because there was someone shooting people on their campus. America is exceptional in that way. You don't have school shootings anywhere else on earth at the level we do. And that's this argument to say, look, if we're so wonderful, how come we have school shootings all the time? And it's literally, we aren't being shot at, but one of our speakers and our students are unable to move around the campus. As we speak, I don't know her status today at this moment. I have no idea whether she and her class are safe or whether the shooter has managed to find them. Let's hope not. So those are the three takes. So you've got Monroe Doctrine saying we kind of own this hemisphere. You've got Manifest Destiny saying God wants the Americans to expand, and you've got exceptionalism in the modern era. We're going to now go back to the historical train, and I want to pick up on the issue that we've talked about a lot in this class, but it's fundamental to American history, and that has to do with the issue of slavery. In 1807, and this was really interesting to me, actually, I don't think I fully knew this. In 1807, the import of slaves was prohibited by the Congress. It had actually been, the Constitution had said that. And Jefferson will get a quote in a second, basically said, look, the Constitution started a ticking clock and basically said, you can't do anything. It never said the word slavery. It was like the import of certain peoples. Oh, that's nice. We're just bringing people in. No, we're enslaving people and bringing them in. But the Constitution said you can't do anything about this for about 20, 25 years. That clock ends, and the Congress responds to it and says, okay, by the way, the Brits and other countries had outlawed slavery. Spain was still importing slaves, I believe, at the time. But the British, I think the Dutch had finally stopped. The Dutch were one of the biggest importers of slaves, enslaved peoples. So Congress says you can't anymore import slaves. There's a marvelous analysis. I've shared this source with you, the National Constitution Center, which has a number of annotated historical references. They do a great analysis of this slave trade clause in the Constitution, the clause in the Constitution that does what I said, which sets a timer on when you can stop the slave trade. Jefferson had slaves. He enslaved people himself. He fathered children with a woman named Sally Hemings. And yet he's the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence that said all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. So, or from the consent of the people, not of the government. But this is what Jefferson, who owned slaves, but who had written negatively about it, and said, look, he's saying to the Congress here, I congratulate you, fellow citizens, on the approach of the period at which you may interpose your authority constitutionally to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in these violations of human rights, which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa, and which the morality, the reputation, and the best interests of our country have long been eager to proscribe. That's powerful stuff. And the Congress did it. And Monroe insisted that they enforce it. There were continued imports, probably about 50,000 enslaved people after that, over a span of a couple of decades, mostly through Florida, some to Louisiana. But the bulk of imports of enslaved peoples had stopped, but slavery had not stopped. In fact, slavery would expand and expand in geographical territory and in numbers. Well, as the country expanded, remember we acquired the Louisiana Purchase territories, and the question becomes, will slavery be allowed in the new country the new land, and eventually in new states, or will it not? And if so, how do we balance it? Well, there's a political question here. The slave holding states did not want to see the non-slave states get an advantage because they'd have numerical superiority in the Congress. And then what would happen? The Congress could take action to end slavery. So there was a compromise. They said, okay, we're going to bring in the state of Maine in the far northeast because the North was generally non-slave holding, and we're going to allow Missouri to have slaves. It was called the Missouri Compromise. It was a trade, a political trade. We'll let slavery continue below a certain level of the country, a geographical level, but there will be northern states that are free. This was called, am I muted here?
No, you need to be muted.
Yeah, okay. It said the host wanted me to unmute. So, okay, so they basically reached the goal and a compromise below the 36 degree, the line of latitude. No slave holding below that point, no new slave states admitted. And above that, with the exception of Missouri, which is not all below that. Uh-oh. Maybe it's just slow. Okay, so Frida Guadalupe Hidalgo. So tensions have been, you saw the map. I wish I could intersperse that map, but you saw the map, which at one point, of course, the Spanish-held territory of Florida becomes part of the US, and now the whole eastern seaboard is part of the US. But what about out west? Well, the portion of the land which we now know as Texas was owned. Well, in fact, if you saw the map, you saw that Spain controlled an enormous swath of land from Mexico, now even the time it was called Mexico, all the way up to the Pacific Northwest was Spanish territory. Certainly California, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, that was all Spanish territory. I'm from a little town in Colorado called Fruita, Colorado, Nueva Mexico, Santa Fe. These are all. Many Americans think that it's all British. In fact, the oldest, as you all know here, the oldest settlement was not Jamestown. It was down in Florida, the Spanish settlements. It is Spanish settlements, right? But most Americans believe otherwise. They don't know that history. So what's happening? Well, you saw that map of the population sweeping in, people moving in greater numbers coming in. And what happens is, I'm going to give you a very quick summary, probably not fully accurate, but this is the essence of it. Americans start moving into Spanish-held territory. Now, it's interesting, Mexican-held territory, I should say. It's interesting that Mexico had outlawed slavery. Well, Texas was a southern state. It's on the southern border. It's contiguous with other southern slaveholding states. American sort of opportunists begin moving into what is then called Mexico and was then called Texas. And there's actually initially some agreements because of internal politics within Mexico to let the Americans come in, providing that they agree to adhere to certain rules and laws that were in Mexico at the time. But more and more Americans start coming in, and then they start basically saying, we don't want to adhere to Mexico's laws anymore. We want to become independent. Make a long story short, there's a famous battle, the Battle of the Alamo, where a bunch of Americans basically made a really stupid decision. They decided they would stay in this Catholic mission, really in the middle of what was then the desert, and they were all killed. It's a very famous battle cry in America called "Remember the Alamo," which meant, as the American story. Remember, I'm telling you the story from the American side, not that I adhere to it, but this is how the Americans have them in. The Americans were fighting for freedom. They were actually fighting to have another place to have slavery. Is a true story about that, and basically keep land. So the Americans are fighting though, and the Mexican government says, no, you guys are trying to break away. You're trying to have a rebellion. We're going to put down the rebellion. And the Americans make a stand at a fort. It was not a fort. It was a Catholic mission called the Alamo. Santa Anna, the then general and I believe president of Mexico at the time, basically says, well, this is not going to work. And they just wipe out all the Americans. They hit them with artillery, relatively few Spaniards killed, all the Americans wiped out, Mexicans killed at the time. But what happens? The slaughter of those people becomes a huge rallying cry for not only Texans, but the rest of America. And so this tribe, remember the Alamo, is a kind of way to say, manifest destiny, here we come. We are going to take back this land. So for a time, so people flood in, there's a battle, the Americans counterattack, the Texans, I should say, they're not yet part of America. The Texans counterattack, chase back the Mexican army, and then there's a truce for a while where the Texas, what we now more or less, the boundaries are different, but more or less what we call Texas now is an independent republic. It's an independent republic for several decades, I believe, but it's not at peace. The Americans are still, the Texans rather, are still expanding. The Mexican government never really liked that they had to settle with this. They didn't really recognize Texas. The US government officially recognizes Texas as an independent republic and gives the Texans an opportunity to join as a state. The Mexicans don't believe that Texas is even rightfully a republic. So the Texans basically join as a state. Well, the president at the time, President Polk, says, all right, to protect the Americans, we're going to move troops into the region. The Mexicans say, wait a second, we don't recognize this as a state. You're now intruding on our territory. This is an act of war, and we're going to fight you over this. It's quite a battle. The Americans make some big mistakes, but so do the Mexican forces. Ultimately, to make a very long story very short, ultimately, at one point, the Americans actually capture Mexico City. And that basically brings about the fall not the fall of Mexico at the time, but it causes them to sue for peace. Basically say, and mind you, you have to imagine what it was like to fight in those conditions, for troops to travel across the deserts. This is really rugged country. I mean, very difficult, harsh terrain to fight for both sides, to travel across the deserts and then actually make a marine landing, I believe at Veracruz, if I'm not mistaken, to make a marine landing and then merge up and conquer Mexico City. And that's when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed. And so Mexico City falls in 1847. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is just a few months after 1848. And look at what the US acquired. If we had that map up again, it would be Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado, and parts of Wyoming. It's an almost the same kind of shape as Louisiana Territory, very similar in scale. And now, so that is how this is resolved. There's debates about what river should be the border, et cetera. We don't need to go into that. But the gist is Mexico abandons that ownership, that claim to the United States. Texas is now a state, and all those other territories, not yet states, but they now begin little by little, as that map showed, to become part of the US territory. But now still the question of slavery remains. What's going to happen? Texas very much is a slave state. They are part of the South. They have that. Oh, and by the way, where did the people who fought in Texas come from? Almost all from the South. You did not have a lot of Northeastern Americans say, oh, let's go down to Texas and fight for slavery. They were happy to the north, but you had a lot of people in Louisiana and other southern states that were looking for opportunities to get land, and they were actually promised cheap land and could buy it down in Texas. Here's a map we have another great graphic I want to show you, but this is a static map of slavery, and I think it's about 1850, if I remember. This is a stationary map, but I'm going to show you a graphic of how slavery expands. It goes fast, this graphic, so I'll try to stop it at one point or another. But this was a map of where the extent of slavery about a few years before the outbreak of the Civil War. But this next graphic, and again, it may go fast, will show the expansion of this on a decade by decade basis. I'll let it loop through a couple of times. Of course, our Civil War starts in 1861. So you see slavery, watch the northern states lose slavery and watch slavery expand to the South. Both in number, when the colors get darker, that means a higher density of slave population, okay? As it darkens, that's more slaves per square mile, as percentage of the population, I should say. And you see that slavery gets outlawed to the north, it expands to the west. When you see that division, you can understand the Civil War. You can say, wait, the North is not engaging in slavery anymore. In the early days, you can see there were some northern states in the early days that tolerated slavery. And you can also see, by the way, that slavery, that our capital, Washington, D.C., is surrounded by slave states. Maryland and Virginia, slave states. I mean, that's where our capital is between Maryland and Virginia, slave-holding states. It helps you understand the Civil War was a closely fought thing. The Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln were calling for the abolition of slavery, but they were surrounded by slave-holding states. And again, the tradition of our country had been our founding fathers had held slaves. So remember, you're not importing any more slaves. So if you don't import more of something and it's a valued commodity, I hate to speak of human beings this way, what happens to the value of the commodity if you're not importing more? The value goes up. So southern states are, and the other thing that happened around this time a little earlier was the development of the cotton by Eli Whitney, which made harvesting of cotton even more lucrative, but also involved more slaves requirement. So you've got slaves no more being imported, a few illegally, but not many, and they're necessary for the economy and they're valuable. If you've got 100 slaves, the value of those human possessions has gone way up. If somebody says they're going to take away your right to enslave people, now it's hitting you economically. Set aside human virtue, that's not on people's mind at this point. It's I can't maintain the lifestyle I'm accustomed to. So what happens? The Civil War. There are books written every day. There are tens of thousands of books about the Civil War. So to try to encompass it in about 5 minutes, as I'm going to do, is blasphemy in a way. But what I want you to understand is a few points about it. How horribly fatal it was. How it really involved the mechanization of war. And one of the first really mechanized in sense of the killing power of human beings that advanced so much. And how terrible it is to have a civil war. And because the numbers of fatalities are just astronomical. And I want you to understand the political challenges that happen. Here's the background. The tension between slaveholding states and free states is growing. The Republican Party is a new phenomenon. There had been a party called the Whigs beforehand, and the Republican Party made predominantly up in the North. There were Southern Republicans, but they really, yes.
Sorry, the war started with the cotton fields, right?
I'm sorry?
The war started with in the cotton fields in the South, right?
The question is, the war started in the cotton fields. Go ahead with where you're going.
Yeah, because I know that in the South there was a rebellion about in the cotton fields. So there start the rebellions to North and to avoid the slavery. Mm-hmm. Sorry for my English.
No, it's fine. I get the concept. So it would not be. Your point is absolutely right in some ways. So there were slave rebellions in the South. And the Southerners were scared to death because in many communities, the percentage of the population who were Black and enslaved was higher than the white people.
Yes.
The white people had control, not because they had political numbers or majority, they were just brutal. They had the weapons, they would kill slaves.
Yes.
They had the weapons, they had the power, they literally had people shackled, and they just ruled by brutality. And so not because they had democratic numbers or a majority. So they were scared to death about rebellions, and rebellions were happening. What was the fear of the Southerners, though, was that what really started it was Lincoln did not run for office on a policy of I am going to abolish slavery. It's really important. He did not run that way. It's a very marvelous book. I should have posted it, called The Lincoln Miracle. It's a recent book. It's about the nominating convention that nominated Abraham Lincoln. The quick summary of it is this. there were multiple candidates. Each candidate was what's called the favorite son of a state. One of the most popular candidates was the gentleman from New York, who was an anti-slavery, very committed to anti-slavery. And there were several others, and they didn't have any of the multiple candidates, a little familiar to hear in a way. None of them had enough votes on the first vote to become the nominee of the Republican Party. The Democrats, by the way, were in chaos. They were picking William O. Douglas. It wasn't good, right? But the Republicans now have a chance, but they can't figure out who their candidate's going to be. Lincoln, in those days, the president was not present at the nominating convention. They stayed home, but they had this whole crew of people who worked on their behalf. And this book, The Lincoln Miracle, is all about this. Fascinating. So what happens? Lincoln was very careful not to insult anybody. The other side was busy insulting each other. So one candidate would say, vote for my guy because the other guy is terrible. And the other candidate would say, vote for my person because the other guy's terrible. Lincoln didn't do that. This is really brilliant too. In the convention hall, which was in Chicago, Lincoln was from Illinois. He wasn't born there, but he was from Illinois. That's where he was living, and he'd been elected to the Congress at one point. Well, Lincoln's people did a brilliant thing. They seated the New York delegation, which was for Seward, very close to the stage as a sign of respect and honor. But they seated the swing states over by Illinois over here. And they put a bunch of people in the middle. And why did they do that? Because if at some point you had to negotiate to get some people to come your way, because if nobody has a majority, somebody has to get to a majority. And they're going to have to persuade people to do it. Well, they created a physical division that made it very difficult for the New Yorkers to come over here and negotiate. And then they actually basically gave away fake tickets to get a lot of people into the building, so that the building was too stuffed for some of the New York delegation to get in. And so there was some trickery involved. But in the end, what happens? The other candidates have so offended their opponents that nobody's going to switch. It's like, I'm not going to come vote for your guy after what he said. Or one group was so stridently anti-slavery, the other was willing to compromise. And so they're looking for somebody who can unite the party. It's in Illinois. It's in Lincoln's home state. They've sort of organized the rally for people. And little by little, Lincoln's total of votes goes up, and Lincoln becomes the nominee. And Lincoln becomes a nominee. Not because he was everybody's first choice, but he was a lot of people's second choice. And American history changed as a result. But he did not come out and say, we're going to ban slavery. Instead, what he said was, we're going to keep the Union together. It's not my effort to ban slavery, but we don't want anybody to withdraw from the Union. And so he did not initially say, I'm an anti-slavery person. He had spoken about it eloquently and powerfully, but he did not run on that platform. If he had, he probably wouldn't have been nominated.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
That makes sense.
Yes.
It's-
You understand my question?
Yes, but the sense of the Civil War, it was really so romantic. I mean, it was so romantic, or it was an economic thing, really.
Yes,
About the North and the South.
yes.
The industry in the North, the production in the South, no slavery, so we can production. If the production don't go from the South to the North, the industry of the North can work. I mean, it was not so romantic as a thing of slavery, or not slavery.
Mhm.
It was more economic because
There was a huge, the question was, this was not just romantic, it was practical in many, There was a difference between the South and the North. North was more mechanized, industrial, mechanized trade, merchant, value added, if you will. The South was more natural resources in the sense of cotton, tobacco, things like that. And to harvest those things economically, you needed big labor. You needed big labor forces who didn't get paid much, like zero, and that was your slave side. So there were differences in addition, and then the population was different. The people who had immigrated to the South were somewhat different than the people who lived in the North. And obviously, the percentage, remember too, interestingly, that the Constitution allowed the South to count Black people as a portion of a human being, for the purpose of deciding how many congressional seats they would get. So those things are all happening. Lincoln gets elected president. The Republican Party platform, while not vehemently anti-slavery, was far more anti-slavery than the Democrats wanted from the South. So look at this date. This is really amazing to me. Lincoln is elected on November 6, 1860. He doesn't have a majority of votes. He has what we call a plurality. So of all the candidates, this is a plurality. These numbers are a popular vote. He also did not get a clear majority of electoral votes, but he got the plurality of electoral votes. And almost all of Lincoln's votes were from the northern states, but he didn't have a congressional majority in either the House or the Senate. The Republican Party did not capture control of the Congress. So now you've got Lincoln as the new president, a divided Congress, a bitterly divided North and South, and Lincoln hasn't even been sworn into office yet when Southern states begin to secede. They start saying, we are no longer going to be part of the United States of America. Imagine you've just been elected president, you haven't been sworn into office yet, and your country's falling apart. No president in our history has ever faced that kind of challenge, that level of division before they're even in office. Lincoln was brilliant, and he created a cabinet out of, his cabinet are the leaders of the government agencies. He created a cabinet out of some of his rivals. There's a marvelous historian, I just blanked on her name, who wrote a book called Team of Rivals, which is about how Lincoln formed a team of people who he'd run against for office, Seward being among them, for example. So beginning in December, before he's sworn in, the South starts seceding. And first one and then multiple others, they start toppling. And then eventually the Southern forces attack a federal fort. I mean, you should have to understand, there's so much negotiation. What would it take for you guys not to secede? Well, you have to promise that we can continue slavery. We want to expand it into the new country from Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. You can't put any constraints on it, etc. And the Republican Party can't do that because they basically said, if not formally, they built a coalition, including vehement abolitionists, people who wanted to end slavery. So we start the war. The Confederates attack Fort Sumter. It basically falls instantly, but it's now our country is attacking our troops on our soil. This has not happened ever before. What does Lincoln do? Well, first of all, then the South then starts forming a government. They create this called the Confederate States, and it's now a Southern nation, is what they're saying. We're a different nation now. And Lincoln says, nope, sorry, this union will not survive if we divide up. He's adamant about that. If we divide, we will forever regret it. European colonists will European countries will take advantage of us. We'll be fighting the wars one day or anyway, so let's have it out. I tried to negotiate. He gives some powerful, eloquent speeches about this in his inaugural. So what happens? We go to war. Here's the tally. 620,000 Americans died because of it. In one battle alone, the Battle of Antietam, 23,000 people died in I think a two-day span. And disease was rampant because in the camps, people were in close quarters. It was malaria in some cases, but tuberculosis and dysentery and other things. And the key generals in the end of the war, Lincoln had some terrible generals he inherited. Really, they were not doing the job, but a gentleman named Ulysses S. Grant, kind of an improbable guy, rose and became a fantastic general. One of the great reads of American history is about Grant. And there was a general named General Lee from the Confederacy. He had been at West Point, our military academy, and he chose to be loyal to his home state when they seceded. And Lee became a mythical figure in the South. He became a mythical figure. He was actually the leader of a rebel group that tried to overthrow the government. But for many, many decades, he was raised up after the Civil War as their hero, almost their god. almost in a kind of manifest destiny way.
He was married to the granddaughter of George Washington.
Yeah, I think he was. He was married to the granddaughter of George Washington. One of the interesting things about the Civil War is it happened when photography was in its early days. A photographer named Matthew Brady documented the horrors of the war. It's really, I don't know if it had ever happened anywhere else, but Matthew Brady's photos are incredibly powerful. And he has pictures of the dead. And the dead were in astonishing numbers. There's an amazing movie. What's it called? Cold Mountain. Thank you. It was a book. It's a powerful book about the Civil War, about what it involved to fight in this fight. And Cold Mountain, if you ever get a chance to see the movie Cold Mountain, it's astonishing. The book talks about, and this is graphic, horrible stuff, but it talks about these assaults on forts where people were climbing over the dead bodies of their comrades. It's bloody, it's gory. They're climbing over each people, desperately hacking away at each other with bayonets and guns. This movie, Cold Mountain, portrays that in all of Hollywood's abilities, and it's remarkable. So the battle, I should say, is not a clear-cut thing. The South is gaining a lot of territory. The Northern troops are failing. Bad generals. We don't take advantage. Because I'm allied with the North, we don't take advantage of opportunities. The Battle of Antietam, I mentioned, the bloodiest day of the war at the time. I think the bloodiest day, if I'm not mistaken, in the history of all U.S. combat. Lincoln realizes I've got to do something dramatic, and he signs the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. The document formally saying, "I hereby, as President of the United States, free all the slaves." He hadn't done it up till then, right? The war had been going for a while. He just said, "I have no choice left." Well, Black people all across the South who heard about this realized we don't have to listen to these Southerners anymore. The President of the United States has freed us. You can imagine how the South responded. They said, "Well, he's not your president anymore. Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy are your government." But it's a huge change. Colored troops, in the day they were called colored troops, Black troops actually sign up and fight with great courage for the Union side. And the great Frederick Douglass, who we read about in one of our prior classes, said basically, you let a Black man fight for his freedom, you'll have no better soldier than that Black man, because he knows better than anybody else what this war is about. An enormous battle happens actually not far from DC, the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a Union victory, but a very closely fought battle. It spans several days. And if the Union troops fail, there's going to be a big march of Southern troops right onto the Capitol eventually, because they're not far away. But the Union troops survive. Ulysses S. Grant becomes the general of the Union armies. A general named Sherman begins a march down from the north through Georgia and elsewhere, basically a no-holds-barred attack, just decimating the Southern states. Basically says, look, the only way we're going to win this war is all-out war. We're going to capture your cities. We're going to burn your cities. We're going to burn your plantations. We're going to not let you people eat. We're going to destroy your salt works. You have launched a war against the Union. We are going to make you pay for this. And Sherman is a hell of a good general. He just works his way down the South, and it breaks the back basically of the Southern defenses. Lincoln gets nominated to a second term, and in 1864 he's reelected. March 4th he's inaugurated. The war is finally going Lincoln's way. He could have easily not been nominated or elected, but a few key victories came in, and people said, "Okay, I think we're going to make it." But it was for a while. Lincoln was thinking, "I'm done. We're losing this war. I'm going to lose the election." And then there were a few key victories came in right at the time that the election was held, and on March 4th, the time frame really is compressed here. March 4th, Lincoln gets inaugurated. Just scarcely a month later, on April 9th, General Lee surrenders to General Grant, turns over his troops. Grant insists that the soldiers be treated with respect. We're not going to humiliate people. He basically says, go back to your farms. The war's over, go back to your farms. And he even let them have weapons, because in those days, that's how you fed your family. So he said, go back to your farms. Don't come after us anymore. We'll treat you with respect. And he treated Lee with great, he could have shot him. He could have shot and hung him, easy. He should have, actually, but he didn't. He treated him as a peer. Well, just look at this. Lincoln's inaugurated on March 4th. Scarcely a month later, he's assassinated by a Southerner an actor who shoots him in the back of the head at Ford's Theater. And then finally, the Confederate Army surrenders a few months later. That's our Civil War. Its legacy to this day, one of the first legacies of it was the passage of the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which we've talked about a little. You get a sense now, and maybe we'll take about a 5-minute break in about 5 minutes or so. But I want you to get a sense, always we're going to take historical events and bring them to the present day. Civil War, we're talking 1860s, well over, we're now 160 years ago. This war was fought, right? 160 years ago. But what's the legacy? Here's the flag of the Confederate Army in 1860. It had a few variations, but almost always something similar to this. These are 7 Southern states' flags as they stood less than 10 years ago. Notice any similarities? The Southern states did not say, gosh, we did a terrible thing. We enslaved hundreds of thousands of human beings, millions of human beings. We fought a war against our own country. We violated the Constitution. We killed hundreds of thousands of our brethren. Our own people died. What a shameful thing this is. Instead, they put it on their flag and said, we may be back in America, but our state, these are clearly flags that are saying we are still proud of the Confederacy. Did you have a question?
No, sorry.
But you could see it, right?
Yeah.
You could just see it. Sometimes these images are more powerful than all the explanation. Here's another image.
It's like the English.
This is January 6th.
Yeah, that one.
People carrying the Confederate battle flag never flew over the capital of the United States, ever. They never got to the capital. They tried, but they didn't. But on January 6th, people carrying the flag of a rebellious, seditious effort that killed 600,000 people, made it into the United States Capitol and carried it alongside a flag celebrating a United States president. Remember how we started the class with the discussion about the indictments of the president and about the 14th Amendment, Clause 3, that says if you engage in insurrection, that clause resulted from the actions of the Civil War. And here we are 160 plus years later, and we're still having some of these repercussions. And people who attacked that Capitol, many of them carried the flag, the Confederate flag, a treasonous flag representing a portion of our nation that enslaved and slaughtered human beings, carried that into the Capitol on January 6th with the full support and encouragement of a former president of the United States. In fact, at that point, he was still the sitting president because we hadn't had the inauguration yet. And by the way, the crowd spurred on who was screaming, hang Mike Pence. Hang the vice president of the United States of America because he wants to have the votes counted from the election according to the way the votes were cast. So we should hang him. And we saw how just this last week, 1 week ago tonight, actually it was, candidates for the presidency of the United States were willing to endorse a man who supported this. And again, I could care less whether he's a Democrat. Democrat did this, I would denounce the Democrat. It is not consistent with the Constitution or the democracy. But there's a brief period. Actually, we're going to take a little pause. We'll take about 5 minutes. We're going to talk about what happens after the Civil War. There's a brief period called Reconstruction where actually Black people gain political power. It's short-lived, but it's powerful and it's kind of beautiful, and then it gets ugly again. So let's take about a 5-minute break. Those of you who've been patiently and hopefully interested watching on the screens at home, we're now at 6:40. We'll rejoin at 6:45. So just a quick bio break, as they say. And we'll see you all in just a few minutes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Brian. We have coffee downstairs. We have the coffee,
But it's got to be quick. So let's pause for just a moment. And thanks everyone for coming back. Let's take a few questions. People from watching on Zoom have questions, or people in the audience here have questions. Let's take a few minutes to address those, and then we're going to move on.
Perfecto, vamos a hacer lo siguiente, vamos a hacer una pregunta aquí y otra pregunta allá en el Zoom. Así que si alguno quiere comenzar, levanta la mano aquí en la plataforma Zoom o dentro de la clase.
If there are none, that's fine too. Just
Y si no, no hay problema, obviamente. A ver si tenemos algún pedido. Sí, Víctor Albures, de Guatemala.
Víctor, ¿cómo estás?
Muy aplicado. Adelante, Víctor. Hola,
Gracias.
Víctor.
Gracias, Juan de Dios. Saludos a todos. Primero, profesor, lamentando los acontecimientos que siguen poniendo en evidencia el tema de las armas en Estados Unidos. Ojalá que todo pase a bien. Y la pregunta es, me llama la atención, ¿cómo concibe usted en comunicación política, cuando usted inició la clase el día de hoy, vimos la imagen cuando la señora que está preguntando a los candidatos, la reacción de todos es que algunos ven cómo levanta la mano primero alguien y luego se animan a levantarla. ¿Cuál es su percepción al respecto? Porque se ve que no con convicción han levantado la mano, sino que le hicieron volteando a ver a sus otros colegas o los participantes del foro antes de levantar la mano. Y luego, otra pregunta que me llama mucho la atención, cuando usted comentaba de este señor francés, porque sí, creo que es el apellido, cuando identificaba al Estado de los Estados Unidos de América, la sociedad de Estados Unidos de América, que podían reparar sus errores. Si usted nos podría dar algunos dos casos de esa reparación de los errores que hayan cometido.
Of mistakes from the Eagles.
Muchas gracias.
So you mentioned that you have the capability to resolve mistakes.
Yes, yes. So thank you for the question. If I understood it correctly and Juan correctly, one of the questions was, how is it that so many of the candidates for the presidency said they would support a president who's been indicted, even if he were convicted? The short answer is that the Republican political party, very sadly, has become not a party of ideas, but a party of personality. And the United States has not really been that very often in its history. But there's an absolute loyalty to the man by many Republicans, not to the Constitution, although many of them think they're constitutionalists, but not to the democratic process. Because, look, 40 different courts of law ruled that there was no election, that the election was not stolen. The facts are absolutely clear the election was not stolen, and yet Trump's supporters believe that. One of the biggest problems in our country, and I think around the world today, is the ability to get only one narrow view of information that may be incredibly biased, the belief that anyone who listens to any other source of information is getting lies. So what's happened is Fox News, for example, or a broadcast group called One American Nation, or others online are spreading really false information, and some people are believing that. And then what happens is it's almost like a loyalty oath for the presidential candidates. Will you support Donald Trump? Notice the question was not, will you support the Constitution of the United States? It was, will you support Donald Trump? And the fact is, the two are not compatible. Donald Trump engaged in unconstitutional behavior. And so if you support Donald Trump, you can't really take the oath to defend the Constitution, but that's what they did. And the paradox is they believe that by supporting Trump, Trump supporters will support them. But the fact is, Trump supporters are not supporting them. They're saying, why would I support you when if I support Trump, I support Trump. He's running for office. So I think it's a bad political strategy, whether you think it's the right thing constitutionally or not. But that's why. Now, the question is, can our system, and the second part of your question, I think, was, can our system truly repair itself? We're going to find out. And one of the things that is so dangerous is that some of the people who are running for president don't want to see the system repair itself. They want power. They want power for power's sake so that they can impose their perspective on how the government should be run. And it's going to be a challenge for us over the next 2 years. It's never happened like this in my lifetime. And that's a big question for us. Let's move, I think. Is there another question?
There was another one.
Oh, please.
From Víctor.
Okay. I missed it.
¿No recuerdas? La segunda es que has dicho que los Estados Unidos, una de sus capacidades, sus activos, es ante los errores, poder resolverlos, exacto, superar los errores. Si puedes dar dos ejemplos de grandes errores del pasado de los Estados Unidos que hayan sido.
Yeah, sure. Great question. So, first of all, we've made real progress in civil rights. It's not perfect, but we've made progress, as we're going to talk about in just a moment. The next topic, in fact, is how after the Civil War, rights were restored to Black people. Then there was a backlash to try to successfully suppress the rights of Black people. And then in the 1960s, 100 years later, in the 1960s, there was a civil rights movement. Again, as we mentioned at the start of class, 60 years ago, yesterday, I believe, was the anniversary of the Civil Rights March in Washington, D.C. We made progress and restored the rights to many, not all, not perfectly, but really corrected some of those mistakes. So there's one example. I think the United States unquestionably, in my mind, engaged in anti-democratic acts around the world at some point, again in the 60s, in our battle against communism, including interventions here in Argentina. And I think we've made progress and are trying to correct that role of our intelligence community. Not perfectly, we've made some huge mistakes, but I think the fact is that information came to light because of our free press, because of people's ability to analyze what our own government was doing and then try to make changes. Not perfect by any means, but we've made some progress in that regard. So let's go ahead and move forward. Thank you for the great question. So post-Civil War, Black people now have the right to vote, not Black women, but Black men at least. And they actually elect a number of people to the House of Representatives and the Senate, because some of these states in the South had majority Black populations. And what happened was Union troops from the North were stationed in those states, and they protected the rights of Black people to vote. And there were many Black people, not a ton, not an enormous number, but several Black House members and senators, which was unheard of in our country. There's a wonderful article in Time magazine by a very prominent Black scholar named Henry Louis Gates, Jr., from just a few years ago. And this period was called Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was trying to rebuild the South, but as a state, as a region of our country that respected the rights of all people. And what happened, however, was there was a disputed election, I think 1876, and basically, in exchange for some of the electoral votes from some of the southern states, there was an agreement to pull the Union troops out of the South. And as soon as they exited, racist vigilante groups from the South, basically who were part of the Civil War to begin with, now moved in and began to repress the rights of Black people to vote, including blocking them at the polls, lynchings. There's an amazing stat, the third point down here. This is a powerful statement. To take one example, in Louisiana, 130,000 Black men were registered to vote before the state instituted its new constitution in 1898. By 1904, that number had been reduced to 1,342. The effort to block the rights of Black people to become educated, to have jobs, to actually vote was incredibly successful. And it lasted really almost 100 years. So Black people were being discriminated against in multiple ways, blocked from the ability to vote, being lynched. Lynched means when a mob basically says, we're going to execute what we believe is justice, and in brutal ways, hanging people from trees, lighting them on fire, cutting them to ribbons with knives. Really an ugly history in our country. There's a powerful, the NAACP is an organization dedicated to the rights of Black people. It's been around for more than 100 years, and they've got a very thorough website about this. And there's a museum about lynching, which is gut-wrenching. It's like going, if some of you have been to Europe and visited German concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz. This has the same feeling to me when you visit this place. An excellent book by a writer from our area, Pulitzer Prize winning writer, Timothy Egan, about how the courage to stand up to a group called the Ku Klux Klan, which we don't have time to go into, but it was a secretive white racist organization that existed throughout the country and was behind the efforts to suppress Black people in enormous, effectively. They were very effective. They included night assaults on anybody who spoke up, whites or Blacks, against racism and prejudice at the time. And Tim Egan's book is a very compelling story of the courage of a few people standing up to the Ku Klux Klan at the risk of their lives. This is an academic article which talks about the whole legacy of that battle against Reconstruction. One of our speakers at the end of the course is going to be a very prominent and distinguished general named Stanley McChrystal. Stanley McChrystal tells the story in this article, and he'll probably talk about it in a class, I hope. And in his book, he does, one of his books, he talks about it. He had always admired General Robert E. Lee. There was almost a cult around Robert E. Lee, the lost cause, the heroic general fighting a good fight. Maybe he fought on the wrong side, but he was loyal to his state. Stan McChrystal had admired him for years, and he finally realized, wait a second, I have admired a man who tried to overthrow our country, who was defending the practice of slavery. And he literally took down a picture that had been on his wall in his office as an inspiration for years, and he threw it on the garbage heap. He said, I'm done with this. It's a powerful article if you get a chance to read it. Okay, now we're going to shift topics for just a second. A pretty quick summary of a few things that happened that had long-term consequences. One was, what's happening to the economy? Post-Civil War, as grueling and difficult as it was, the American economy grew rapidly, partly because of the technology that we've talked about before, partly because even as grisly as our Civil War was, Europe was not in great shape either at the time. And so the American economy began to recover, but there were some financial catastrophes, including in 1907, a panic where people didn't believe that the banks had enough money, that they deposited their money in. People had what's called a run on the banks. They tried to get their money out. I think 14,000 banks collapsed, if I'm not mistaken. And they created a new central bank, which exists today, called the Federal Reserve. It would be an entirely, you can do an entire class on this. There's a marvelous book out recently by the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, and I would recommend that. But just to be aware, this happened in 1913. So we're going to go fast through this. The main points of this are, no, thank you. The main points of the next section is, okay, so often history is written through wars. We talk about history as if it was all only made up of wars. They are profoundly significant events. I want to point out a few quick things. These are timelines, and I'm not going to make a whole lot of this because we don't have time to do it tonight. As you know, World War I is this horrific slaughter of human beings in Europe. Trench warfare, a new kind of warfare, the machine gun, poison gas, armored tanks, air combat, etc. I was in London on the anniversary of the armistice, and surrounding the Tower of London, there's a grassy area where they used to have water. They made these little poppies out of ceramics, red poppy flower on a thin wire. And they planted those poppies, one for every British civilian killed in World War I. The entire area was a sea of red. Military or civilians, military or civilians. The entire area was a sea of red. Just all those young lives, please.
Sorry, just a comment. There are some photos. I don't know if the World War I or World War II with the troops around the Tower of London. Mm-hmm. So it's very impressive because they all get together there, and it was lots of people.
Yes, the point was, yes, there are photos of this. If you look at the photos of the poppies commemorating World War I casualties,
yes,
it's an image that so powerfully shows the slaughter. Well, what's happening, and I won't go into tons of detail, the Germans and the French and the British have fought to a stalemate. The Americans finally get involved after being neutral for a long time. Once the Germans were basically attacks on Western shipping, as a matter of fact, and there was the Lusitania got sunk with Americans on board, etc. The Americans entered the war we spend 1 million US troops a year. Now think about this. The American people are basically saying, look, many of them, this is not our fight. This is Europe. They've been fighting for centuries. Why are we going there? Well, the British and the French prevailed upon us to fight, and we were concerned about the Germans, and the Germans were sinking merchant ships, and we sent 1 million troops. That's a lot of American soldiers, and 116,000 died. It turned the tide. The US troops turned the tide. Eventually, Germany capitulated. There was the surrender, etc., and the armistice of 1918. World War I is over, but a lot of Americans have died in that process. And the interesting also thing that happened was there were other, aside from the military consequences, there were other things that happened that were momentous. Women became very involved in the industrial society because they had to. The men were off fighting at the war, but somebody had to make the bombs, somebody had to make the tanks, the airplanes, somebody had to take care of the wounded, etc. So the role of women begins to rise up. That's going to be important in just a second. So women played an active role. One of the women, the case the women made, the suffragists. Suffragette, it turns out, is a diminishing word. We call the women at the time called themselves suffragists, which means suffrage is the right to vote. They were saying, look, so you supposedly sent 1 million Americans and 100,000 died to fight for democracy. Women at home don't benefit from democracy. What is this? And around the same time, the then Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, initiated the right for women to vote. And so the whole point was, wait, the communists are letting women vote?
We have to.
You're expecting us to help you supply the war and you won't let us vote? Finally, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was passed by Congress in 1919 and ratified by the states in 1920. That's pretty late in the history of the United States.
Yeah.
It was partly brought about for many years active by women, courageous women, but World War I had a significant impact on that. The other thing that happened from World War I was a new international role for the United States in a number of ways. We were the dominant economy after World War I. Europe had torn itself apart. The United States had not been touched by the war, except we lost a lot of lives, but there was no combat on our soil, no destruction of our infrastructure, no challenge to our government. So even though we lost a lot of people, we emerged as the strongest nation, one of the strongest nations on the planet. And our president tried to say, let's create a League of Nations, President Wilson, let's create a League of Nations so that we could stop wars. Remember, it was called The War to End All War. There's a marvelous book about the Middle East and the agreements that were made there. It's a deep, deep read, but it's called the War to End All Peace, I think. The Peace to End All Peace. It was the statement being, we fought a war to end all wars, but we came up with a peace treaty that will also end all peace. And that's how we divided the Middle East up. It's a fascinating read. So Wilson proposes the League of Nations. People say, well, we don't really want to be in the League of Nations. Some people said, this is a great idea. We'll stop wars. Other people in America said, no, let's just let those people, let's stop going over and getting involved in their wars. They've been doing it forever. We're not going to shed any more American blood. The American economy goes crazy. It goes really strong. We called it the Roaring 20s. The enormous economic expansion, enormous economic opportunity, but it doesn't last. The Great Depression, caused largely by speculation in the stock market, especially the US stock market, but it has ripple effects throughout the world. It starts in October 29 crash. There's 9,000 banks fail. It lasts actually for almost an entire decade. The unemployment becomes 25%, which was enormous. And people were out of work. They were losing their homes. They were losing their business. It was desperate. And if I can play, I'm going to try to play a song that was this is interesting too, because now we've got radio. We've now got phonographs. And so now people are experiencing the Great Depression through photography, through phonographs, through radio. And we're going to talk in a second about Franklin Roosevelt, who comes in as the president in the middle of the Depression and all that he does. But I want to play you a song, if I can. I don't know if it'll play. We'll see. If it doesn't, it's okay.
Remember to, yeah, it is some nature song.
Okay, that's good.
They used to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed the mob. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream, with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line, just waiting for bread? Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a tower up to the sun, brick and rivet and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once in khaki suits, gee, we look swell, full of that Yankee doodly-dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell, and I was the kid with the drum. Say, don't you remember, they called me Al, it was Al all the time. Why don't you remember, I'm your pal. Say, buddy, can you spare a dime?
Well, the reason I wanted to share that with you is you go from the roaring economy, everybody's getting rich, the America's the lead nation in the world, suddenly it collapses. My generation's parents were all products of the Great Depression. It so affected them that they were a very frugal generation. They didn't want to spend money. They didn't want to speculate in the stock market. They really knew how desperate it could be because the whole country had collapsed, basically. All the dreams of the roaring 20s, the sense of manifest destiny, basically that we had our boundaries. We were the lead power in the world, and it all collapsed. What do you do now? The country's in terrible shape. They elect a president who many consider one of either the second or third greatest president in history after Lincoln and after Washington. Most scholars will say it's FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The right wing in our country hates Franklin Roosevelt, but a lot of people love him. And here's what he did. Oops.
Say, don't you remember, they called me out.
I screwed up there. Sorry.
Well, you can move quickly with it.
To see how fast we've gone through history. Okay, so Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets elected president, and it is time for some really huge interventions. There had been this sense of what's called laissez-faire economy, that the federal government should stay out of the economy, let it run. The stock market will take care of everything. Big business will take care of everything. government should stay out of the way, and then the whole thing collapses. Roosevelt comes in. He was, by the way, a victim of polio. So he had suffered polio as a boy. He was from a very wealthy family, but he suffered from polio, and he's the most disabled president we've ever had in terms of physical disability, but tremendously courageous and positive. And this was in the days of radio. So entire families would gather around the radio. It was a miracle invention. And the president of the United States could speak to the American people directly. And he had what he called fireside chats. And quite literally, people would gather around the radio. If your family didn't have a radio, you would go to your next door neighbor. And Roosevelt would say things like, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And inspiring speeches about how we're going to overcome this. And he with the Congress, instituted significant reforms. He didn't just say, okay, government's going to stay off of this. He said government has to deal with it through regulation, controlling the financial markets so we don't repeat the problems we've had before, and through significant government spending programs to put people back to work and build infrastructure. So on the regulatory front, it's amazing the impact these things had. Each one of these achievements has almost all of them have profound lasting impacts. A system called the FDIC to protect banks so that your deposit in a bank, you can have confidence you're not going to lose your savings. Allowing labor to organize instead of just letting big business pay people terrible wages and let them and unsafe working conditions. Monitoring the stock market to try to prevent the speculation that we've seen in the fake reports and the short selling that had led to the crisis. The Farm Credit Administration, farmers lost their entire crop, lost their property, and many farmers lost everything. So how do we restore credit to farmers? The Emergency Banking Act to try to keep banks afloat, and then the so-called Glass-Steagall, not so-called, it was called that, banking regulations about how deposits will be managed. That was on the regulatory side. This was even bigger. A whole set of programs and initiatives to put people to work. The Agricultural Adjusted Administration gave relief to farmers. The public works, the idea was American people need jobs. They're desperate. They can't feed their families. Let's put those people to work creating and building things. Let's not just let the economy sit there. Let's take government money, stimulate the economy, put people to work building highways, roads, bridges, buildings, etc. There was a marvelous group called the Civilian Conservation Corps. If you travel through the American West especially, but in the East as well, they took people oftentimes from the inner cities of Detroit or New York City or Boston, destitute, and said, we will take you to the wild lands of the West and you can build national parks. You can create buildings, you can create trails, you can create roads. If you visit Yellowstone, Yosemite, Mount Rainier, Mount Hood, Grand Canyon, you'll see evidence of what these men did. They sometimes made $1 a day, if that, but they had dignity. They weren't a burden on their families, and they built our national park system, at least, and those things still stand today. Magnificent testimonies. The Tennessee Valley Authority, through the Southeast, created a dam system and transportation system that provided affordable electricity to the Southeast of America. Still functions today, the Tennessee Valley Authority. There was a homeowners revitalizing act, a little thing called Social Security. If the one thing you can't do as an American candidate is say you want to eliminate Social Security. Everybody says, oh, we hate socialism. We hate everybody on the right. We hate FDR, but we love Social Security. Why? The senior citizens vote. Now, here's the problem. It has a huge fiscal deficit. We have not responsibly funded it, but no senior. Lots of seniors will say, I hate those damn Democrats, but don't touch my Social Security. Well, guess what? That was the party that brought you Social Security. This is really important to me personally. The Bonneville Power Administration created a distribution network for electricity in the entire Pacific Northwest and funded enormous hydroelectric projects. That was in my district, and the legacy of that. The Bonneville Power Administration still exists. One of the fruits of this was a giant hydroelectric dam called the Grand Coulee Dam. These are massive the mighty Columbia River, which is an enormous and powerful river. They dammed it up. They created these hydroelectrics. This is such an interesting thing. This was happening in the late 1930s. The power from those dams, created aluminum smelters and provided a great excess of power that then went to help develop the atomic weapons at Hanford, Washington, that needed enormous resources of electricity. It built the agricultural community that was the breadbasket that fed not only our country, but the world. It built a transportation network, but it provided affordable electricity that created aluminum, produced aluminum for the bombers in World War II, and was a power source for a lot of the manufacturing. That decision of government intervention to put people to work, harness and create reliable energy may have helped. I don't think any question it helped us win the war ultimately. It wasn't, the war was around the corner, but it was a hugely important decision. And it got the economy back on track. The American economy recovered. This is a chart of the international economies before World War II. You see that we went from depression in the US. Now, mind you, the whole world had been in depression, but our economy prior to 1938 is far and away the strongest economy in the world before World War II. So that the ability, the things that Roosevelt put in place really helped the economy recover. Now, tragically, what happened to World War II? You know this story. We're not going to go into it in great detail. Yes.
It's a funny thing, but not so funny. My father, he was a partisan, Italian partisan. He is, he's alive. And when he was 16, the American troops arrived to Italy. And so he went with the American troops and worked with the American troops.
Wow.
The guy was very young, but he knew everything. And afterwards, the American state, they make him a certificate, and I have it, I will bring it to you. Because it's very interesting to see a young man that is alive, father's alive, still is 96. And I think he's the last partisan in the world.
He might be.
Because he was very young when he went to the war.
That's an incredible story.
And he has wrote a book about how was Italy before the war and why they arrived to this situation.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Fascinating. I don't know if the translator is able to make that. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you, Joel. It's an amazing story.
Yes.
So the very quick summary of World War II, but the main point is, what effect does this story have on the American self-identity? And go back a little bit to the exceptionalism. We'd seen our young men get slaughtered by more than 100,000 in World War I. People did not want to see that happen again. A big isolationist trend happened in the US, which said, we're not going to intervene anymore. We had demilitarized to a large degree after World War I. We had ramped up production to create airplanes, tanks, etc., ships in World War I. We had shut almost all of that down. There's a significant anti-intervention approach led, interestingly enough, to some degree by Charles Lindbergh, who was one of the most famous people in the world, having flown the first transatlantic solo airplane flight. He would make speeches about don't get involved in Europe. There were actually people called the Silver Shirts who were supporting Nazi Germany in the US. There was a fascist movement in the US. So in the 30s, throughout the 30s, Hitler's now in power, Mussolini's in power, Japan's expanding through Manchuria, etc. The US is staying silent. Roosevelt, however, is providing support, but he doesn't have the political support domestically to go all in favor of challenging Hitler. Tragically, Jews, of course, are being slaughtered. The concentration, it's shocking how early in Hitler's reign the first concentration camps were established. We knew about it to some degree, and we didn't act, and neither did the rest of Western Europe. They sort of let Germany do its thing. In the long run, paid an enormous price. The US stays out of it until December 7th, 1941, when Japan, which had been expanding through China and Korea and the Philippines, then sneaks up on the US and bombs Pearl Harbor, and suddenly the war is on. When Winston Churchill learned about Pearl Harbor, he realized, and there's some powerful biographies of Churchill, he had been pleading with the Americans, please help us, join us, form an alliance, declare war on Germany, send us weapons. And we were helping through land lease agreements, helping fund their war effort. But Churchill basically, a tragic day for America, Churchill said, we are going to win this war. If the Americans are in, and now they're all in, we can beat Nazi Germany. Had not Japan done that, I'm almost certain Britain would have followed. I don't think any historian believes otherwise.
Brian, hay una diputada nacional de Argentina que se llama Marcela Campagnoli. Marcela, por favor, si quieres hacer tu comentario aquí abiertamente.
Por favor.
¿Qué tal, profesor? Buenos días.
Yes.
No, le quería comentar que tuve la oportunidad de ir al Museo de la Segunda Guerra Mundial en Nueva Orleans, y me conmovió. Está muy, muy bien armado ese museo, con muy buenas recreaciones de los lugares donde se combatió, pero hay muchos videos cortos de esa época y hay una en la que el presidente Roosevelt informa que todas las empresas americanas se van a poner ahora a fabricar armas o barcos, es decir, todo lo que se necesitaba para la guerra, para poder pelear por la libertad de Occidente, y muestran toda la cantidad de muertos, de mujeres y de hombres americanos, y bueno, a mí me emocionó mucho ver el compromiso del pueblo americano en defensa de la libertad y que hasta dio su vida por ella, ¿no? Así que en base a eso, como a ustedes americanos, se lo quiero reconocer y agradecer.
Thank you for sharing that. That museum of World War II is very powerful. And it's such as you described, it is so part of our psyche as Americans. What our nation did in World War II. We've made a lot of mistakes, but World War II
Así es, muchas gracias.
rose to the occasion. And let me share with you a little bit about that. It's a perfect observation. Once the U.S. was in, we were all in. Whoops. These are pictures. It's a delay. Okay, so the U.S. joins. We send everything we've got at it. We start building airplanes. We start building ships. We were putting bombers out, full-blown airplanes every 60 minutes. We were creating a ship every week, a brand new ship. These are amazing numbers. The mobilization of the United States to support this war effort was unprecedented, and we threw millions of American soldiers at it. And all around the world, in Italy, in Japan, in North Africa, in the South Pacific, in all parts of Europe, in the North, et cetera, all around, Americans are there supporting other troops, supporting the Australians, the French. Of course, the French were in the underground at that point. They collapsed early on. But the British, we came in and helped save England. England had done amazing things battling Germany, but we came in. Meanwhile, if you want to see a very powerful movie, I don't think I have some concerns about it, but the movie Oppenheimer, meanwhile, the United States. What's that?
It's now in the theater.
It's now in the theater.
Yes.
The U.S. silently, behind the scenes, begins to create the atomic weapon. And they do. And we drop, first of all, we had been firebombing. The atomic weapon did not solve the European theater. We just fought our way, along with other Western countries, onto D-Day, battled our way into Berlin. Hitler fell. Now we've got Japan. Japan has sworn we're going to fight island to island to the last person. If we all have to commit suicide, we're going to fight you there. The Americans have been firebombing Japanese cities. Japanese cities were made of wood. Most of their towns were made of wood. And we dropped incendiary devices and had massive fires in Tokyo and many, many other parts. And Japan was suffering, but they were willing to fight to the end. The atomic weapon gets built in places, including the parts of it built in our own state of Washington, in New Mexico, and other parts. And we built 2 bombs, dropped them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan realizes, oh my God, we surrender. And that stops war. It's believed that had that not been for those weapons, we would have lost multiple billions of American lives trying to fight island to island. And this will surprise you, but at one point, the president of Japan gave an award to the American who directed that bombing campaign. And his argument was this: if it weren't for that, the war would have gone on, as horrible as that was, the war would have gone on for another year or more. We would have lost that many more civilians, and Russia would have conquered Japan. Now, I'm not saying it was a good thing that Hiroshima or Nagasaki happened, but it was a complex time. Yes.
Profesor, solamente voy a decir que es un tema muy controvertido y que es un tema todavía no cerrado, porque hay una teoría que dice que fue bueno para salvar vidas y otra que dice que si fuera juzgado hoy ese hecho, serían condenados seguramente toda la escala de los que tomaron la decisión.
Fair point.
Obviamente esto es muy controversial.
I'm not saying it's not for sure, it's controversial. The challenge, however, was the argument from America at the time was, look, we were not intervening. The Japanese wiped out our fleet in the Pacific Islands. What they were doing in China and the rape of Nanjing and others was horrible. Obviously, Hitler in the concentration camps. And early on, there's a marvelous book called The Bomber Mafia. There was a real effort. This is a great book. It's Malcolm Gladwell, called The Bomber Mafia. And the argument is there was a branch of the US military that was trying to do precision bombing with B-29s and a bomb site to drop very precise bombs just on the war manufacturing areas. The problem was we weren't that precise. Nowadays, we could put a bomb into this classroom if we wanted to. But in the day, these bombers would fly and drop their bombs, and who knew where they landed? But there was a real effort to try not to do that. And we were losing tremendous numbers of bombers and pilots and crews. And finally, the American command said, this precision bombing is not precise. And we don't know how to stop this otherwise. And it became, that's why the firebombing happened. So the bomber mocked
12 kilometers all around killed everything.
Yeah. Firebomb.
No discrimination.
Yeah. So what's the outcome? More than 16 million Americans served in the armed forces, 405,000 killed in action, 671 converted. The American story, our own interpretation, is that through no fault of our own, a world war occurs. Freedom and democracy are imperiled all around the world to fascist dictatorships, Italy, Germany, Japan. And the country that rises to save the day at enormous cost is the United States. I think there's actually a lot of truth to that story. And many Americans believe that was our finest hour. In fact, in America today, that generation is called the greatest generation because they went and they served. And these are images that if you're an American, this is your understanding of the history. The Japanese attack us. On the right is the invasion of D-Day. And by the way, if you get a chance and you're in Europe, go to the Normandy beaches, the beaches where the landing happened, and see this field of crosses. Colin Powell had a very powerful statement. I won't get it quite right. But he basically says, the American people liberated Europe at the cost of thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of American lives. And we didn't take over and claim any bit of territory to be owned by our country. All we ask, said Colin Powell, is enough place to bury our dead. And for Americans, that's powerful. And when you go to Normandy, it's powerful. And just like your father, I have dear friends who liberated concentration camps, very dear friends, who were the first people into the concentration camps, who opened the gates, who tried to feed people, I just talked to a friend yesterday. My wife heard the same story. A friend of mine's father, when he passed away, my friend opened his dad's wallet. And that generation did not talk about the war. Almost every kid my age went sometime with their friend into an attic in the house where there was a box that their father kept their medals and their war memorials. They didn't come home and say, look at me, I'm a big hero. I want free season pass in a ski area or something. They did their job, they came home, and they tucked it away, and everybody did it. My friend's father's wallet, he told the story just yesterday. In his wallet, he had a picture of concentration camps. He carried it with him his entire life. He had liberated the concentration. And he understood the horrible things human beings can do. And he was part of liberating it. He never wanted to forget them. So these are the troops coming home. One of the things that happened was there was this camaraderie. Americans had served together. And as the question was earlier, these numbers are astonishing. This is the American production of military armaments during World War II. The sheer numbers of combat aircraft, of ships, I think that's the next slide, of major, look at how many naval vessels were produced. It was an all-committed thing. And again, women were central to it. There's a thing called Rosie the Riveter. Rivets are when you shoot metal screws to hold two pieces of metal together. Women were doing previously what was called men's work, and it was very important to the liberation of women. And look at how the U.S. economy soared. As horrible as the losses were, our mainland was untouched by the war. There were some tiny skirmishes here and there, but none of our infrastructure was destroyed. Our manufacturing, our residential, our farming, none of it was touched by the war, whereas all of Europe was decimated. Japan was decimated. China was decimated. This is an indication of how many women played a role in our armed forces, in all branches, and in the nursing corps. Women flew planes, not in fighter combat, but they would ferry planes to different islands. They served obviously as volunteers in the military, as nurses. It had a whole number of roles they played, and it was a significant portion of our war effort. So this is, so at about this time, the other thing that's happening is U.S.'s role internationally is increasing. So we're becoming a global power, not just militarily, but economically. One of the key events of that period is the Bretton Woods Conference, where the International Monetary Fund and what would become to be called the World Bank were created. And in both cases, American and its currency played a central role. Our currency became our currency, the dollar, and gold became the international standard for monetary policy. And we created these entities both to help restore countries that had been decimated by the war, in the case of the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank to try to stabilize the global economy. In Europe, and there was a thing called the Marshall Plan, which was an effort not to destroy. Many conquering armies do everything they can to decimate and wipe out the economy and infrastructure of the country they just defeated. We spent an awful lot of money trying to help Germany rebuild through a thing called the Marshall Plan, named after General George C. Marshall. And that is another thing our country feels proud of. We defeated fascism, we liberated Europe, and you could say certainly the Philippines and Japan, etc. And instead of crushing everybody who was there, we helped them rebuild. I should also say that for a long period of time post-World War II, when I was young and put my thumb out and hitchhiked around Europe, I was welcome. People would say, "You're American? Please come in. You saved our country." The French especially did that. There was this huge appreciation for Americans. But the economic power, the manufacturing strength, then the other thing that happens about this time is, I don't know what was on here. The UN gets created as well. I don't think it's on this slide. But we let our defense readiness decline. All that manufacturing, we withdrew it, we reduced it. We had people occupying Germany and Europe and Japan, but we significantly lowered troops, really some shocking decreases in the military spending that cost us readiness. We paid a price for that, and the world paid a price for that. In the next war, well, this is a public document by the U.S. Army talking about how short we fell in terms of expenditures for military readiness. Then the Korean War happens. This is a huge blow to us. It was a war that people call the Forgotten War, but what happened? We had demilitarized, the Soviet Union had strengthened, Korea had been divided between the US and the Soviet Union. We pulled out, supposedly both sides pulled out. North Korea was strengthened. North Korea invades South Korea, and basically a blitz movement. And Americans who had thought we were the strongest military force had been sort of living a pretty easy life in Japan are suddenly thrown at the invading North Korean army and get wiped out almost, just completely overwhelmed. They've got more numbers, they've got better training, they've got more firepower. The Russian tanks, our guns just bounce off the Russian tanks. The UN now engages, which the US, as you know, helped lead the creation of. UN engages, international forces apply. I won't bore you with the whole battle. It's not boring at all. It's fascinating, but it was not a victory. Whereas there's no question we were on the side of victors in World War II. This was not a victory. We fought to a stalemate, partly because when we counterattacked the North Koreans, China then counterattacked us, sending hundreds of thousands of troops over the border, and we had a stationary. That war, by the way, is still, there's never been a peace treaty signed. An armistice, a cessation of fighting, but it is still considered, those two nations are still considered at war. By the way, we did not declare war. It was considered a police action. So the Congress did not declare war in this case. I won't go through that because we don't have time. The Cold War now extends. The first picture is what's called the Berlin airlift. The Soviet Union is blockaded Berlin and said Berlin is going to be divided into East and West, and you can't get any food in, and they're going to try to basically turn West Berlin into a communist portion, just like East Berlin. The US president starts sending in airplanes to drop food to West Berlin because we can't get there by land. And whole squadrons of planes drop food to the West Berliners, and they actually sustain it. And so West Berlin stays in the middle of East Germany, basically, not quite the middle, but stays a free state. This picture on the right is a famous picture of an East German soldier. Right as the wall is going up, he looks around and he says, "I do not like what I'm seeing here." And he jumps over the barbed wire just at the last minute almost and escapes to freedom. He actually led a rather sad life after that, but I've always found that an inspiring photo that this guy says, if I have a choice between communist repression or freedom, I'm going to take my chances and jump this barbed wire. So Kennedy gets elected. Again, we're fast, right? We've lost the war in Korea, or we fought to a stalemate. Kennedy gets elected, and here's this young, vibrant, energetic young man. He'd been a hero in World War II. His ship, his small patrol boat, got sunk, and he helped rescue all his crew. He's the son of a very, very wealthy man who would support his campaign. He's kind of an improbable guy because he's young, but he brings in a new generation. And these are words from his inaugural address. And what you're going to see throughout this discussion, I hope, is this pattern of mistakes, but rising to it. And America having a greater, more positive vision. Kennedy embodied this. Kennedy was this youthful figure basically saying the torch has been passed to a new generation. And these are stirring words. This was a powerful moment. And the impact of Kennedy on not only the US, but the world, I don't think can be overstated. These are more words from his inaugural address. These could apply, I think, to almost any country today, to Argentina today. I mean, this need for some inspiration, for something that says, we are going to do something remarkable. His last words for Kennedy, "So my fellow Americans," this is how he closes his speech. It's almost the last words. "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Tens of thousands of young people signed up for things like the Peace Corps and other things to say, how can I serve my country? And also then he says to the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. And this is in the context of the Cold War. This is a clear demarcation. Is the United States and the rest of the world going to stand for freedom, or is communism and fascist dictatorships in one form or another going to prevail? And Kennedy rises to that. And America feels uplifted. And frankly, the world did. When I traveled Europe as a young man, you could see people, you'd be in people's houses, they would have a picture of Kennedy in their wall. It was that powerful. Tragically, as we know, Kennedy was shot. Here's America rising again, and this tragic death happens. The crushing effect of that is just hard to put into words what that did. It's bright. He was symbolic of the country, and then he gets assassinated. But we didn't have assassinations. There were assassinations earlier in the history, obviously Lincoln, and a couple of early ones, but nothing of the magnitude of Kennedy, and certainly nothing covered on television. We now have full color live video of a president getting shot to death. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement is happening. This is what's happening is Kennedy was actually supportive of civil rights, but not dramatically enough. Peaceful protests, nonviolent protests were led by Black civil rights leaders. This gentleman here I served in Congress with. His name is John Lewis. He's the human being I most respect that I've ever met in my life. These guys are walking in, they're trying to cross and march and say, Black people should have a right to vote. They're dressed in their suit and their tie. They're unarmed. They're singing religious songs. And they're told by the police, you must disperse. John says, what are we going to do? And he says to Isaiah Williams next to him, they were actually, when they first saw this big group of police, they said, I can't swim. We can't jump off this bridge. We got to keep marching. And they're told, you have to disperse. This is an unlawful assembly. And a few minutes after this happened, by the way, not on my birthday year-wise, but the day of my birth. I wasn't born, I was born well before this. But you can see what happened. Police with dogs and cannons and truncheons are beating the Black protesters. This became live TV, and this was a weekly magazine that almost every American read. So suddenly, whereas the civil rights movement had been a Southern thing, but suddenly people all over the nation are seeing pictures of peaceful protesters being beaten and attacked viciously, and it changed understanding of what was happening. If you want to read a marvelous book about a courageous man, especially the young people who I know there are so many young people here joining this book, Walking with the Wind, a memoir of the movement, is a powerful testimony to how a young man from a very impoverished family rose up and said, I want to make a difference. His parents said, don't do this. You're going to get beaten. You're going to get us in trouble. And John Lewis has this phrase called good trouble. I'm going to get into good trouble, meaning I'm going to do something that matters. And he was beaten, almost killed. His friends were killed. He was put in prison multiple times, and he adhered to nonviolence. He's one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. And he's always, when he was an older man in the Congress, one of the most famous people in the Congress, I have pictures of him, my little boys, then 4 years old. John comes out and goes, how are you? He got down on his hands and knees and gave them high fives. Whenever guests would come, and I'd say, John, would you mind meeting these people from our district? He'd go, of course I would. So kind. And yet when the time came to fight an injustice, John Lewis would say, never give up, never give out, never give in. He lived the movement. And he was there with Dr. King when they gave 60 years ago yesterday. John Lewis addressed 1 million people almost on the National Mall, right beside Dr. King. He was 21 or 23 at the time. Spoke with great eloquence, courage. He's an amazing human being. Dr. King, again, we've got rising to try to, we've talked about this cycle. Dr. King, recognized around the world, wins the Nobel Peace Prize, assassinated by an assassin's bullet. The hope of Black people across the country shot down at a young age, a marvelously eloquent, courageous man. At the same time, the United States is doing amazing things. Kennedy, in his, I don't think it was his inaugural address, but very early on, said the audacious thing. People had barely orbited the Earth. And Kennedy said, in the next decade, we will put a man on the moon. And we did. It was amazing, super risky, super dangerous, but we pulled it off. They landed and they made it back home. And those of us of my generation remember watching that moment on TV. It was amazing.
It was amazing.
It was terrifying. It's like, are they going to make it? They landed. Holy smokes.
Of July.
Yeah, it was amazing. And all that led up to it, all the technology, all the commitment, that's America at its finest. Then comes Vietnam.
My mom.
Yes, please.
Sorry, it's,
Oh, please.
sorry.
Go.
My mom has a letter from the MASN NASA because in the 69 here from Argentina, you can write to them to the astronauts.
Wow.
She was a little girl, so she put them on the like un cuadro.
Frame.
Yeah, the frames thing.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yes, and so she has it. And say with the NSA and work at the men, work for the moon, Armstrong, you know.
Wow.
Yeah, it's like and nice to remember that.
That's a wonderful story. That's the kind of impact America. So that's the paradox, right? America's putting men on the moon, and then we're having civil rights protests. Something really beautiful, incredibly inspiring, and also inspiring the civil rights protests, because if people can finally get the rights to vote, that's inspiring too. But now comes the war in Vietnam. We kind of accidentally get into this. The French fight unsuccessfully. We support the French pull out. We try to help them on the theory called the domino theory, that if Southeast Asia falls to communism, supported by Russia and China, then all sorts of countries are going to fall. And little by little, but pretty rapidly, we start putting a lot of American men into the field in Vietnam. And I won't go into all the details, but whereas we had won World War II, we fought to a stalemate in the Korean War. We lose the Vietnam War. We lose the communication war at home, and we lose the combat. And I have so many dear friends and family members who served with dignity and honor and courage there. But the pain they feel and seeing Americans die in a war that we didn't win, and where we were siding sometimes with non-positive governments in South Vietnam, and engaging, sadly, sometimes in very atrocious acts, that scarred us as a population, and still does. It divides us, and still does. So we're going to see a little bit of that as well. North Vietnam prevailed. This is the toll in terms of casualties. South Vietnam, 250,000 people or more, almost 500,000 civilians. United States, 58,000 Americans dead in Vietnam. And these were drafted. A lot of these people were drafted, meaning they were forced to serve in the military. 18-year-old boys, barely out of high school, forced to get in uniform. Now, Donald Trump, his foot had been hurt, and he couldn't fight in the war. So he didn't serve, but a whole lot of other people did, often poor people who couldn't have hire attorneys or get a college deferment, etc. And the battle at home was brutal. We had now, again, live pictures from the conflict, or not quite live. We didn't have satellite images, but within a day you could get live or nearly live video. And in the lower right is an event that was really scarring, and I want to show you something about that almost to finish tonight. It was a college campus called Kent State. President Nixon, who was not popular with young people, had authorized strategically that we would expand the frontier of the war to Cambodia and start bombing in Cambodia. Protests rose up around the colleges. People, their friends were dying, right? Their friends were being drafted, getting killed in the war in Vietnam, and wondering why. So college students rose up in protest. And in one particular university called Kent State in Ohio, there was powerful protests in which students got shot. And we'll see if we can show, and mind you, at this point, the popular culture is rising up. This is a powerful song that was very prominent at the time, and I'm going to play it. We're almost done, but this will give you a sense of the turmoil in our country.
To
get a sense of the turmoil that's happening at the time and the heartbreak. Now our own soldiers killing our own students at the time. That turmoil is incredibly powerful for the United States. Then that was followed by, oh wait, we got to stop this share. I'm gonna pause it. There's one other slide, but I don't have to get to it, but just leave it. I want to get the questions. That was followed by the Watergate scandal, in which President Nixon had authorized the unlawful wiretapping of American citizens, and clearly violation of the oath of office and the rights of American citizens. So that's a long history in a short time, and there's so much more we could have covered. But let's give a few minutes for questions at this point. I have some good news. I don't know the total of it, but our guest speaker, Kathleen Duvall, is okay. Her team is okay. The state of emergency in their campus has called off. I don't know the details beyond that, but she's all right. And we'll try to find out more about it.
Are you going to continue with this?
No, we're not going to. So we're happy to take questions at this point or comments.
Okay. El que quiera hacer una pregunta, por allí está Santiago Traini, perdón. Adelante.
Thank you. Hello, Brian. One question. To what extent does the United States still carry on the Monroe Doctrine, and how does it harmonize with the U.S. currently expansionism and security system on our current world in this status quo?
Great question. This is my observation of it. I think the Monroe Doctrine was used in one way or another to justify many of the interventions that you know all well, probably better than most Americans know of. Interventions in Guatemala, El Salvador, in Nicaragua, here in Argentina, elsewhere. That was part of the philosophy of why that was done. You know, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a direct part of the Monroe Doctrine, that we're not going to let other powers build footholds here. The interesting thing from my perspective is that there's still philosophically a sense that we're entitled to the Monroe Doctrine. But to be perfectly honest, our country has neglected the hemisphere that we share with South America for too long. We've not been down here as well as we should. That's part of why, to be honest, why I wanted to teach this class. Not to say that America's great, but we've got to build stronger relationships with democratic, free market, rule of law countries throughout the world, but certainly in this Western hemisphere. So I think philosophically it's still there, the sense that we somehow need for security reasons, but also that we have some right and that we have this American exceptionalism. But I don't think, if you look at the foreign policy awareness of the United States, it's focused on Russia, China, the Middle East, usually to the neglect of the Southern Hemisphere, whether it's the Western Southern Hemisphere or Africa. So we have tended to focus more on Europe, China, northern part of Asia, and but it's still philosophically there, but we haven't strategically wisely handled that.
Tenemos a Santiago Rodríguez. Adelante.
Hello. My question was regarding, I was checking some numbers, and currently the current Congress is about less than 20% former military, former veterans, right? It used to be a very larger number. Usually, well, like 20, 30 years ago, was about 50%. Do you see a relationship between those numbers and the way Congress is related to the people right now? Like the distance that Congress has with its constituency?
A really interesting question. There's a couple reasons for that. Previously, almost everybody served in World War II. I mean, every one of my uncles and my father on both sides of my family served in World War II. And that was true for everybody. So, and some, not that they all saw combat. My father didn't, but two of my other uncles, his brothers did. But they all served in some way. And so that was just almost, how could you not have served in the military at that point? Then Vietnam happened, and as I mentioned, that was a draft war, often fought by lower socioeconomic people. And there was such disillusionment about the government and the military at that time And then it shifted to an all-volunteer force, so the military downsized a great deal. Interestingly, in the Congress today, there are both Democrats and Republicans who have served in Iraq and who have served in Afghanistan. In some ways, they work very closely together. In some ways, they took different lessons away from that experience in both those theaters. And one of the questions really, I think, is, and there are some really distinguished rising members of Congress who served in combat in both of those theaters. And that, I think, they may shape the future. My own personal insight, if for what it's worth, I think, for example, General David Petraeus, who was a commanding officer in Iraq and then in Afghanistan and then headed the CIA, would be an outstanding president of the United States. Not just because he served in military, but he has a strategic sense. He's proven his worth in service, and he's stunningly brilliant. But it's one of the questions about our Congress today is how does military service and affect leadership?
Tenemos de vuelta a la diputada Campagnoli. Adelante, por favor.
Sí, quería comentarle que cuando fui al Museo de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, me llamó la atención que había veteranos de alrededor de 80, 90 años recibiendo a los visitantes y que estaban condecorados. Y eso, yo ya era diputada en ese momento y me disparó la voluntad de averiguar qué había pasado con veteranos argentinos que combatieron en la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Habían más de 5.000 argentinos combatieron en la Segunda Guerra Mundial, alistados en las fuerzas británicas como enfermeras, aviadores, gente que fue al frente o gente que manejaba las máquinas de comunicaciones. Y pudimos hacer en el Congreso de la Nación un homenaje a muchos de ellos que están vivos y si no a sus familiares, y nunca habían recibido ningún agradecimiento de los gobiernos argentinos que hubo en todo este tiempo, así que estaban muy emocionados que lo hubiéramos hecho.
It's very powerful, and you see that honor and recognition of our World War II veterans in our country. That's through, you see, there are literally thousands of memorials and monuments and museums to our veterans throughout the United States. Thousands.
Inclusive en los aeropuertos.
Yeah, the airports are named after them. There are memorials, graveyards.
Tenemos dos más preguntas y aquí está Alfredo también, serían tres. Y bueno, está un poco pasado la hora, pero vamos con eso entonces. Carlos Fernando Fraile, por favor, y luego Joaquín Fernández.
Thank you. My question is, how do you see the participation of the USA in the human rights forums? And if that fact have to do something with the American exceptionalism? I mean, the thing about the American exceptionalism made me remember a discussion between Scalia and Anthony Kennedy about the use of foreign law in the sentences of the Supreme Court. And the fact that the United States, for example, didn't ratify the convention about the rights of the children.
Yes. It's a great question. And we talked about it a little bit in our discussion last week about the fact that the US had a central role in the creation of some of these international organizations and then does not actively participate. Well, we participate at some level, but we haven't ratified and agreed formally to be in some of these. I think your observation is very astute about the American exceptionalism. There's somewhat of an attitude of the world court should exist because there needs to be somebody who adjudicates legal decisions that protects human rights, but it doesn't have to apply to us because we do this anyway. We need to mute something, I think. We do this anyway because we're exceptional. The idea is we don't need the law to apply to us because we're exceptional. We wouldn't violate human rights anyway. But the paradox is, but we don't participate because we're afraid someone would say we do violate human rights. and could then prosecute our soldiers or our civilian leaders. So it is a paradox, admittedly, and I think it's a problem. But this divide is largely conservative Republicans who would oppose participation and progressive Democrats who in general would support participation in these international.
Si por favor se pueden mutear.
We need to get up. Can everyone check their mics and make sure they're on mute? Except the person who's speaking.
No. Sí.
It's not in here. It's not abierto, Juan.
Oh my.
You know what? Maybe this is God telling us we can't go. Okay. You know what we can do? It's because we're not getting to the root of this. I'm going to say thank you. Okay.
Perdón, está muteado el... no se escucha.
No. We're going to finish for the night. Gracias. We're leaving tonight and we'll get together next week, same time. And the questions that weren't asked, I promise you, we will start the next class with those questions, but the audio is not working. Have a safe week. We'll talk to you soon.